Welcome in, friends. It's Friday. It's time to talk about Stargate. We're hanging out here with, I've got a very special guest to introduce to you guys today for our Friday hangout. Laurence Moroney has been involved in all kinds of interesting projects, from Google's AI lead advocate to the companion Stargate AI projects, to the SGU comics, which is why I have this up here. I'm going to talk about that and lots more. So let's bring in Laurence. Welcome. Thanks for being here with us today.
Hey, thanks, Darren, and hi, everybody. It's great to be here.
Now,
Always love to geek out about good stuff.
yeah, you are a Stargate fan, and I want to hear the story. I want to talk about your fandom and some of your favorites to kick us off. But I'm
Sure.
really interested to hear your stories about how you got connected with the franchise, because you've had your fingers in a lot of different pies that are either part of the Stargate franchise itself or sort of directly adjacent with licensed stuff, with the work that the Companion was doing a few years back. Uh,
Mm.
so yeah, where do you want
So
to
I
start?
guess probably how it started with the initial connection with the franchise
Yeah.
was, oh my gosh, it's quite a while ago, probably 2007, I think, when SGU was starting up. I was working for Microsoft at the time, and part of my job was to find like showcase applications to show off Microsoft technology. And I was working on a thing called Silverlight, God rest its soul. And one of the things that they were looking to do was like to find good media partners. And I had a very funny meeting where I was called down to LA and called into like there's a part that used to deal with studios and movie studios, and they really wanted to build up the relationship with MGM. And MGM obviously owned the Stargate franchise at the time, as well as things like the Pink Panther and James Bond. And Microsoft were kind of schmoozing them because they really wanted to do some kind of like really cool stuff with James Bond. But MGM were like, we got this new TV show. We've built these amazing sets up in Vancouver. It's really cool sci-fi stuff. You really should do that. And so that the suits called me in to kind of say, okay, I think you know this sci-fi stuff. Have you heard of this show called, what was it? Not Star Trek,
One of the star
Stargate. That's
somethings. Yeah.
yeah, and I had to put on my best poker face and not go all like fangirl on them. And
I am a
it was
grown
like
up.
exactly. And I was like, yeah, I kind of know about it. What do you need to do? And they were like, well, the MGM really want to kind of do something to showcase this new show that they're spending all this money on. But we want James Bond. What do we do? And I'm like, well, why don't we kind of make them happy by doing something cool with this show? And then they asked me to ideate around it. And so I came up with a few ideas, and I went to meet with some of the executives from MGM, and they were really great people, by the way. And they were geeking out about how much money they had spent on the sets for SGU,
Yeah.
because they really wanted to make it look dated. They wanted to make it look ancient. They had like, there was the thing called the Apple Core, that control center that was just like the coolest looking thing I've ever seen. And they were showing me concept art and photos, and they were like, how can we make this pop? And at the time, I'd actually been doing some work for NASA on the Mars rover. And I had built some like kind of 3D walkarounds of the Mars rover, and I showed them those and said, why don't we do that for science fiction as well as for
Hmm.
science fact? And they loved it. So that was like where the whole idea of the photosynths was born. I also had a whole bunch of other ideas that I wanted to do that didn't get implemented for budgetary reasons.
Yeah.
But we started with that one. And so then it was like a week later, I was up in Vancouver. I live in Seattle, so it's a short drive up to Vancouver, to go visit the sets and just completely nerd out. It was so much fun, and hired a professional photographer to take photos of the sets. And I would build the photo synths on the spot and show them to Brad and Robert. And they were like, this one's good, that one's bad. Can we do this? Can we do that? And it was a very fast kind of iterative thing. And, not only did I get hooked because I like the show, but I also began to get really hooked because I like the people.
Yeah.
So John Lennox, the producer, he and I had a few beers together and a lot of laughs. Brad, of course, Robert, of course. They were filming one episode while I was there. I can't remember the name. It was a first season episode. We're on the snowy planet. It was called Ice or
Oh yeah.
Water or
Water
something like that.
is episode
Water,
6.
thank you.
Yeah.
And so they were filming that while I was there. So Brad and Robert let me go behind the cameras, and all the snow was kind of done with like dried potato flakes. But
Oh
this stuff
yeah.
would really make you cough. So I was like double masked up, and I'm behind and I guess I have sensitive airways or something. And they were trying to film a scene where like one of the characters falls into a crevice, and I
Yeah.
was like
You
the
couldn't
whole
keep it
time.
quiet.
But they were very nice to me. So like, after that, like again, like I always liked the show. I was a big fan of
That's great.
Atlantis mostly. Sad that Atlantis had to make way for Universe. But it was very cool to be a part of that. And then, just been hooked ever since.
I remember this
And
project. I remember what a treat it was, right? They were rolling out a brand new show. It was a different kind of show. And they had the Destiny set, as you said, was a marvel. I had a chance to
yeah,
visit it before the show premiered. Uh, I I don't think I saw filming. Like, they were in between setups. But to stand in the gate room and see the gate, see the way that they built it practically to actually spin, the
yeah,
staircases, the apple core, right? They built that set with steel. They built it to last.
yeah, yeah.
And
They actually had to inject concrete under the studio because the set was too heavy and the
oh
studio was
wow.
beginning to sink. So they injected concrete underneath and stuff like that to reinforce it because they like had put so much effort into the sets.
Yeah. But it was a work of
Brilliant.
art, and it was a real treat for fans to get to see it in the way that you guys presented it. So I remember downloading and installing Silverlight so that I could do this virtual tour, walking through with, right, these high res images stitched together. And it was fun. You get to go through not just the gate room and the apple core, but you could go out the door and down the
Yeah,
corridor and kind of look around the Destiny sets in some detail. You could stop and look at a wall, look at a door panel, and zoom in on it.
yeah.
It was
And
great.
there was like the doors that they had like those kind of spinny spirals on the doors, and then they had ancient writing on those. We didn't realize, like, within an hour after we first published them, some fans had zoomed all the way in on
Okay, so
those,
this is where I'm
and
going
they had
next.
translated, right? And I think they posted it on Gate
Oh, and
World, and they had
translated the
translated the
the
text.
ancient.
Yeah,
Oh, that's cool.
yeah. And
Yeah.
it was
Do
just
you
like
remember
silly
what
stuff.
any
It
of
was
it
all leet
said?
speak. It was all leet speak, like, be careful, this thing is spinny, and stuff like that. And, we were like, we were thrilled. And then, I remember I called the MGM folks and was like, oh, is this okay? Because like, this is like kind of breaking the immersion a little bit
Yeah.
because whatever artists were joking, never thinking
It's
that people would
showcasing
see
the
it.
artists and the
you
set
know?
builders, yeah, who put in those little
Yeah,
Easter eggs like watch your step and danger pinching
yeah,
hazard.
exactly. And it was like, and so like I called the MGM folks and like, should I pull it down because like, this is breaking the immersion? They're like, no, this is so cool, and they were like, these Easter eggs are amazing, and it kind of humanizes the
Yeah.
show and stuff like that. So they
And the
were
chance
so
for fans
thrilled.
to scrutinize the set even
Yeah,
before the show premiere was amazing.
yeah. Although there was one. I mean, it's offline now, unfortunately, but there was one where they had those funny doorknobs that you kind of push it and then the door would slide open,
Mm.
and they were made of painted wood that was then glued onto the to the
Okay.
to the door panel. I actually broke one of those,
Did
and
you?
nobody noticed.
And nobody
It was
noticed?
nobody
Just
noticed.
get
So
your
I'm like,
gun
I
and
keep
stick it
kind of
back on the wall.
yeah, something like that. And I kind of want to go through the DVDs at some point or the Blu-rays now of the show, and like, when did they fix that
I
doorknob,
need
the
to
one
find
that
it.
I broke?
That's amazing.
So it's like,
Yeah, so I was as a fan site creator, with limited access, especially with SGU. The PR side of things was kind of locked down before the show premiered. They were not putting
yeah,
out a whole lot of press material, although Sci-Fi Channel did eventually do a screener, a little press kit that I got, which is the press kit alone was cool.
yeah.
A little push button light up
Yeah, the,
chevron
the
on the
book
front
and the
of the book.
DVDs inside. Yeah, I got
Yeah.
one of those. It was really neat.
So what I did when your Silverlight project came out, kind of knowing that official websites come and go, Gate World has outlasted 5 or 6 different official websites over the last 27 years.
Congratulations.
I went through your virtual Destiny walkthrough and just took as many high res screen captures as I could.
Mm.
And I made a gallery, which has been on Gate World
Oh,
ever since
wow.
2009. So guys, if you go to SGU Season 1 in the Gate World Gallery, stargategallery.com, or go to gateworld.net, promotional photos, and then scroll all the way down to the bottom, past all the episodes, Destiny Set Tour. And these are from the Silverlight virtual tour.
That's right.
I have all these high res.
Wow. I love the ones where we took up the close-up pictures of the gate. We took hundreds of them to
Yeah.
stitch together like into a huge gigapan. Although what's really interesting about it, you may not realize, is that in real life, the lighting of the set is actually much warmer. It's like much browner instead of dark like this. So a lot of the darkness for the show was added in post-production.
Mm-hmm.
So we actually used the same post-production folks for the photos as they used for the show, so that we could get it absolutely authentic.
Oh, interesting.
And then like some of the sets obviously had green screens in the background. And again, we did the same thing. The effects folks who worked on the show replaced the green screens with, hyperspace and stuff outside to make it as immersive as possible. But yeah, it was really cool. And one thing, I got into trouble posting on Gate World because the day we were photographing the gate itself, there was like there's two vents beside where steam blows out.
Yeah.
And oh, you see the doorknob there. You can see that one. If you click on that, you could see the lead speak, and that was the image that people had translated.
Oh yeah.
The
Ancient. There's two rings of ancient text, isn't there?
Yeah, and people were speculating on Gate World about whether the gate, was going to no, just various things about the gate, and somebody was speculating, is it going to blow steam out of those vents? You
Yeah.
can see it in that picture you're pointing at, and I just
Wait for this to
posted,
load. There's the steam
absolutely it
vent.
does. Yeah, it absolutely does, and it's so loud, and it scared the crap out of me
Yeah.
when I was there when they were testing it. And the MGM folks were like, "You're not supposed to say that," because again, you were talking about the PR lockdowns, like, we don't want to spoil the surprise for fans. And I was like, "Oh, sorry," but yeah, it's like, but I thought they delivered brilliantly in the end, and it was just some odd things that you could talk about and odd things that you couldn't talk about.
I mean, as far as an official website goes, a studio website or a network website, I've seen a lot over the years for Stargate and for a lot of different shows, and some of them are better than others. But this one sticks out in my head. If you
Oh,
ask me
yeah.
about creating content, right, fan centric content to promote a show, this my head goes first to this virtual Destiny tour, which I loved.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to recreate it someday. Now, I mean, photosynth and silverlight are long gone, but in AI, we got a thing which is spectacularly named Gaussian splatting. And the whole idea of Gaussian splatting would be for me to be able to do something quite similar. And one of these days, I'm going to dig into the archive. I think I have the original photos before they did the post-production on them, so it might look browner. But I'm going to have a play with Gaussian splatting with with the SGU stuff. Maybe when the new Stargate show comes out, to kind of be like a, hey, remember us, kind of.
Cool. Okay, let's back up. You've got lots of interesting Stargate projects to talk about, but let's back up and talk about your fandom. So you got connected, you were working at Microsoft at the time
Yeah,
when you got
yeah.
connected with the SGU production up in Vancouver. But you were already a Stargate fan, I take it?
I was,
When did
yeah.
you first
So.
discover the show? How did Stargate get its hooks in you?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, obviously, first discovered it with the movie, and so I think the movie was like late 1994. But I was living in the UK at the time, and I think it came out on my birthday in 1995. So my wife bought me a birthday present to take me to see it. And I've always been a geek
Good
for
wife.
Ancient Aliens. Oh, she's great. We're still married all these years later. And yeah, I've always been a geek for like ancient alien stuff, Egyptian, Irish, that kind of, so like I loved it. And it was like, I think at the time they said it was planned to be a trilogy, but then the trilogy never happened. And a couple of years after that, I emigrated to this country. And then I was reading an article about how they're turning it into a TV show. And that's what got me really excited because, it's all very nice to be able to do a movie, but you can really go much more in depth when it's a TV show. And so that's when I got interested. But frankly, I remember the first couple of seasons were on Showtime. And at the time, I was a recent immigrant to this country and I was like on a very low paying job. So
Hmm.
I couldn't afford Showtime. And, there was a website in the UK that, because it was available on video cassette or DVD in the UK. And I remember they used to put episodes streaming on this website, but they were 256 by
Oh
256
yeah,
pixels,
I remember
right?
this.
Because Oh, you've seen it, right? I
I
tell
think,
people
yeah,
about it. They
if it's
used
the
to
website
stream the
that
size of
we
a
were
postage
watching
stamp.
back in like season 5 of SG-1, they were bootlegs, I think, that people would rip off of the Sky broadcast and put on. We called it squinty screen
Yeah.
because it was the image was so small.
Yeah, and so it was like really it was only the sound. I actually it was almost like listening to an audio play because you couldn't really see anything. So the first few seasons I kind of tried to watch like that. But then a few years later, thankfully financially got a little bit better for me. And Costco started selling the DVD box
There
sets.
we
And I
go.
remember it was
There we go.
$65, right? I mean, it's a bargain, right? The
I
whole
remember,
and
yeah,
so,
I was there day one every season.
and me too. Every Tuesday when it came out, I'd be straight into Costco and to buy the box. And then it was also had moved to the Sci-Fi Channel, which was on basic cable. So I think that was around season 5 or 6, started being able to watch it on the Sci-Fi Channel while catching up from the DVDs. But that was right around what? When was Atlantis came out? Was that in line
Atlantis,
with about season 8?
yeah, Atlantis premiered in
Uh,
2004, summer of 2004, which was with
okay.
season 8 of SG-1.
Okay. Because I do remember buying a box set and it had like a free DVD attached, which was the pilot episode for
A little
Atlantis.
promo for Atlantis, nice.
Yeah. Do you remember that
I
one?
don't remember
They
getting a
kind of gave
promo for
I
Atlantis,
have it,
no.
still have it somewhere because it was like you bought a season of Stargate SG-1 and then it had an Atlantis, free Atlantis. So then I watched, and it was Atlantis was the one where I really got hooked, and that's when I was watching it from day one. And yeah, huge fan of it, huge fan of McKay in particular.
Yeah.
You know,
That show came
if it was,
along at just the right time because I think because the show had moved to Sci-Fi Channel in the US, there was a new expanded circle, right? Kind of a critical mass of new fans who were doing just what you were doing, catching up either by buying the DVDs or watching the Monday through Friday reruns on Sci-Fi Channel. And then there was a new show all of a sudden, right? So for a lot of Stargate fans, it was, oh, I get to start at the beginning. I get to get on
yeah,
the train as it's leaving the station, and this is going to be
yeah.
my Stargate show.
It really appealed to me that one. It's the a tiniest detail, but the characters all had the flag of their country on their sleeve. Like McKay had the Canadian flag, and others had the Scottish flag and the US flag and stuff like. And it was something about that just made it feel like a global community and the kind of thing that I had a huge affinity to that,
Yeah.
and that's why I was like hooked on SG-1 from. Sorry, hooked on Atlantis from day because of that free DVD. So whatever PR person had the idea of
It
putting a
worked,
free
yeah.
DVD, it worked. So. And maybe it's worth something now as a collector's item. I got to go dig
Oh,
in
I'm
my
sure it
archives.
is, yeah. Yeah, I
You
have
know.
one of the Atlantis discs I have up there is they before they did a proper release of the seasons, they did like a fan's choice with like
Oh,
4 episodes on a disc. It was just kind of a preliminary test the waters. Are people going to buy the Atlantis show? Yeah, and
right.
I think those are hard to find,
Oh,
relatively.
I can imagine. And you're not letting go of it. Not anytime soon.
No, in fact, there was stuff I was too dumb at the time to like scoop up all this stuff. So there are a lot of things across Stargate collectibles that, were just sort of ubiquitous when they were first out, and I just
Yeah.
didn't bother, and now they're hard to come by.
Hindsight's always
But I
2020,
do have
right?
some nice collectibles. Yeah, I've got that SGU press kit. Uh
That one's
so
beautiful.
yeah, favorite well, do you have a favorite show? As much as you sort of you got on board with SG-1, Atlantis found its way into your heart, and then you were hands-on on the set for SGU. Is it picking a
Yeah.
favorite show like picking a favorite child?
It is like picking a favorite child. I think I love them all differently, but if you kind of like, put a Zat gun to my head and like ask me which one, I'd probably have to say Atlantis,
Okay.
because I think that was the one that impacted me personally the most. I think at that time in my life, I was a 30 something working at Microsoft, surrounded by geniuses, expected to be a genius, not being the greatest communicator in the world. And, I still remember the first episode was when they first kind of get into the city of Atlantis, and Rodney is kind of like trying to say, there's not a whole lot of power. And people keep trying to bring things online, and he's going, power,
Using power,
power,
using power. Turn it off.
using power, and it was like, and it was, that was how I communicated at the time. And it was like, I couldn't figure out why people wouldn't take me seriously, and it was, and then I remember watching Atlantis and watching him like learn and grow and like stuff like that and learn to be a better
Oh,
communicator. I was
that's
like, oh, there's
beautiful.
something in this for me. And the irony is
That's
now
really
that like
lovely.
David, who plays Rodney, and I are good friends now. So it's
Yeah.
like kind of weird, like all these years later, to be like that. But it's yeah. So it's I think that would be the one thing that makes it special for me. And I still remember there was one episode. I'm terrible with names, but there was one
Okay.
episode where there was, you know, it was McKay and oh gosh, I'm losing on names, but the main character in Atlantis,
Shepherd.
the white guy with the shepherd, thank you, with the messy hair, that he and like McKay kind of visit a planet and there was like a queen or a princess there. And it's like, Shepard's supposed to be the hero and McKay's supposed to be the coward. But it ends up being flipped around the other way. And there's like, they have a painting at the end. You remember
Yeah,
that
yeah.
episode?
That's a
Uh,
Harmony in season 4
okay.
with
Because I remember,
young Jodelle Ferland,
oh, really?
who went
Wow.
on to co-star on Dark Matter for Joe Malazzi.
So I watched that episode with my daughter at the time, and like it was like my daughter was really young at the time, and I was like, I think my wife was working night shifts, and sometimes my daughter wouldn't sleep, so like we'd be watching TV together. That's how we discovered Star Wars together and Battlestar Galactica and others. And then I was watching that one episode, and she was like, "I like this, and I like Rodney." So then we would like watch lots of Atlantis episodes together as well.
I can do this. I can find this.
Yeah, it's in there somewhere. It's just
Oh, there's no cast photos of it. I'm gonna have to go to my screen caps. Okay.
Man, I'm putting you on the spot. Sorry, Darren.
No, no, I love it.
There is a painting right at the end of the
Right, it's right at the
episode.
end, isn't it? Let's go to the
Yeah,
end.
and it's like the painting has Rodney being the hero holding the gun. Yeah, that's the one. I want that on my wall.
That was, yeah, and when we went into the production office in subsequent years, this was hanging in the middle of the production offices.
Oh,
It
wow.
was a huge painting.
Oh, I can imagine. It's a great painting. I wonder
Probably,
where it
yeah, I
is
don't
now.
know, 7 or 8 feet tall framed.
By the way, funny story about Atlantis. When I was doing the SGU stuff, the first time I went to the studio, I kind of went to the gates of the studio and the security guard, and it was like looking for me and my name. And, he said, okay, your name, you're on the list, and you go. And I'm like, well, where do I go? And he was like, oh, the production office is like, just turn right, and you'll see there's a big building on the right, and just go in the door there. And I'm like, okay. And it's me, and there's a photographer with me, and we kind of go and we open the door and we walk in, and it's pitch dark, right? And it's like, okay, we're probably not in the right
This is the
place,
right
but it's
building,
like,
yeah.
yeah, and the guys that the photographer was like, well, that's what he said, turn right, first door on the right, that kind of stuff. And I took out my cell phone and like used the flashlight of my cell phone looking around for a light switch. And then I find a light switch and I turn it on, and we're in the gate room of Atlantis. I was like, I don't think we're in the right place, but this is really cool. It was like the steps that lead up to the main consoles and stuff like that were at the bottom of those steps. I almost tripped over them in the pitch dark, but we're like, we're in the wrong place. And it turned out the production office was directly above that. They
Yeah,
were supposed to go
it was just
upstairs and go.
upstairs. That's amazing.
Yeah. And so,
What
yeah,
a
it
way
was
to
like,
discover the lost city.
I know, I was waiting for it to rise out of the ocean, but I was worried I was going to get kicked out of the studios before I'd even done a thing. That I broke into Atlantis. But yeah, that was really cool.
So I assume then McKay is your favorite character from Atlantis.
Yes.
That's a
Yes.
great story because, right, we talk about how Stargate has had an impact on us as fans, as viewers. It's easy to talk about, right, growing up as a fan and discovering a show like I grew up with the original Star Trek and the Next Generation. A lot of people watch Stargate with their parents or with their
Mm-hmm.
kids, but you came into Stargate as a young professional in your 30s, and it's still
Yeah.
these characters in this world, and the writing and the performances help to shape you and help you, as it sounds, to sort of come into your own as a young professional, as a geek, as an engineer, as a
Yeah.
that's amazing. So do you have a favorite
Yeah. And I think
Rodney episode? Or
probably
would
the
it be
one we just
Harmony?
spoke about.
Harmony?
First episode rising, just the whole power, power, power. I think I still do that. So it's but I think those would be the favorites. But yeah, it's been a long time since I watched them. I need to go back and watch them again. And yeah, so it's a bit of a blur now to be able to pick out a specific one. But that one
You got
really
to do a
stands out.
rewatch every few years.
I, I really should. I really should. The big one on my rewatch list at the moment is Travelers, Brad's show on Netflix. I don't know if you've watched it,
I
so if you're a
have.
fan.
It's a
Isn't it
great,
great?
it's a great show, yeah.
But it's the one of the things that's really funny about it though is I was watching it, I was hooked on it, I travel a lot, so a lot of the times the only time I really have to watch TV is when I'm traveling. And I discovered Travelers and I was watching it, absolutely binging it. And I got through like one and a half seasons. And I was on a flight from Hong Kong back to Seattle in, what is it, 2020. And it was the same flight as the first person who's generally thought of brought COVID into this country
Oh,
because he
wonderful.
flew from Hong Kong to Seattle. And then there was like an outbreak in Kirkland's, in OAP's home. And
Yeah.
I was like, when we traced it back, it was like, holy crap, I was on the same flight. And I was watching the Travelers episode about an epidemic. Right?
Great.
So when COVID started, and I've been watching, I haven't been able to go back and watch it since, because it kind of hit really hard to home. And I'm like, so I've gone back and I've started a couple of times, but I need to go back and watch it again. So yeah.
Wow.
But good stuff. If you haven't watched it, fans, you got to go watch it. Brad's writing is brilliant, and
Very well
it
written.
and one of the things that I loved about Stargate, and it was something I brought up when we did Stargate AI, was I was doing very deep analysis of the writing because I needed to kind of build models
Right, right.
that would understand how the characters talk and how the characters think. And so that meant I was dissecting all of the writing in the show. So, like when you have a screenplay, you generally have action descriptions where it's saying what's happening. Jack and Sam run away from the explosion, something like that. And then you have dialogue, so this is what Jack says. And then you have parentheticals, which kind of give you a little bit of the emotion.
Yeah.
Jack says it sarcastically or something like that. So I was building models kind of based on all of those. But one of the things that I started doing when I was looking at the dialogue was I like to kind of do an analysis of the person's character and their personality from how they from how they speak. And one thing that came out was that Brad's writing in particular is always so optimistic and so
Mm,
positive. And it's like something that's really sadly lacking in the world today, that
mm,
he can write dark stories about dark things, but the people going through those dark stories and dark things are good people. And I think that was one of the things that really struck me about the Stargate in particular, SG-1 Atlantis, where it was like, hey, these Wraith
yeah.
are like modern day vampires who will suck the life out of you. And these are real heroes who are out there to stop them, but they're good people. And you watch these people and they make you smile and they make you happy. And it was the language analysis that I was doing of that was like, it was like so many of the sentences would begin with the word well. When you
Mm,
start a sentence with the word well, it's hard to go wrong, that kind of thing.
interesting.
And it's that type of, optimism and good feeling and, just positivity that we need more of in the world. And I think that was one of the things that when I was watching Stargate at the time, it was subliminally being absorbed. And then it was later when I was kind of building the Stargate AI that I was explicitly seeing it mathematically. And I think,
Yeah.
that's one of the things that gave me such an affinity to the show.
That's fascinating. And to Brad's writing in particular, I can think of
Yeah.
3 episodes off the top of my head that are dark and very serious. Episodes like Abyss when Jack is being tortured.
Mm,
Episodes like The Shrine when McKay is slowly losing his memory and his
mm.
identity. And it's Brad doesn't write them as dystopian. He writes them
Yeah,
with hope, right? Those scenarios are always pierced with hope.
exactly. And it's good people don't cave into darkness. And that's the true heroism, right? The true hero isn't the person who has the big muscles and the gun and who blows away the enemy. And I'm not just talking about Teal'c, but it's also like, that when the good person doesn't get corrupted by the badness that's around them, they may lose, they may suffer defeats and setbacks, but they don't get corrupted by it. And I think
Yeah.
that was one of the core things about the Stargate that I really liked. And like in Travelers, there was one character. I was actually just chatting with Brad recently about this character, and I was embarrassed that I forgot the character's name, but it's Philip in Travelers. And if you haven't watched Travelers, it's like I don't want to spoil it too much, but it was like somebody from the future's mind can jump into somebody from the present's body. And in the case of Philip, it was a person from the future jumping into the body of somebody who's about to die of drug addiction. So now imagine your mind suddenly being in a different body, and that body is racked by all of these addictions and that conflict that happens within the character, and how that's negative and it's dark.
Yeah.
And but how it became very positive, and how like Philip became such a encouraging character, that it's like, just, it blows my mind. It's great stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. Beautiful. I love Philip's character and his story for sure. And the actor was on SGU. He was in Common Descent. He was one of the Novans.
Oh, interesting. I have to go watch it again.
Yeah, with much shorter hair.
You have encyclopedic knowledge, Darren. I'm impressed. This is
I just
incredible.
index all these things on the website over so many years, right? So we just go to SGU episodes season 2. I'm also showing off the new website, which just relaunched.
It looks good.
Thank you. Common Descent. And there he is. That's Philip.
Oh my gosh, it is. Wow.
That's Riley Dolman.
Patrick Gilmore was also in Travelers.
Yes, he was.
Yeah, I just saw his name there. I noticed when you dropped down SGU, there was the Kino videos.
Mm-hmm.
That was one of the other things that we were trying to do for SGU that I really, really wanted to make happen. But something that, unfortunately, the budget wasn't there. But the idea was that we had written, or I had written, a couple of speculative episodes where the idea was that while the main story is going on with the main crew,
Yeah.
wouldn't it be really cool for us to do a lower decks kind of thing with other people on the ship, and build then a second screen experience, so that if you're watching this with your laptop or something like that, that while the main episode is showing on TV, then something that's happening in lower decks is showing on your laptop, and they're synchronized with each other. So I don't know, for example, the ship is under attack, and I'll use Star Trek as an example. The ship is under attack, and the engine room is down, and Captain Kirk is on the bridge, and like saying, "Scotty, give me power," and then you usually hear a voiceover of Scotty going, "She can't take any more, Captain." That kind of stuff. It'd be really cool that if you were seeing Scotty on one screen while Kirk and the bridge and the main plot on the other. And I had kind of figured out a technology for that, where it was we would embed hyper audio sounds in the main broadcasts. So these are sounds that the microphone on your laptop can hear,
Yeah, but
but
your ear won't.
human ear can't hear. So then you have an app running on your laptop. This is before iPads and phones were as commonplace as they are now. If you had an app running on your laptop, then it would hear those sounds, and then it would use those to synchronize. So that way, even if you're watching a recording, you would still get the second screen experience.
That's amazing.
And it was really, really cool. But they didn't have they didn't have the budget to do it, and B, it turned out as digital cable was coming online and becoming more and more common instead of analog cable, that the MPEG compression that digital cable used would actually wipe out those signals.
Was going to cut those hyper
it,
frequencies.
yeah, in order to
wow.
compress it to keep the human ear. So I actually built a couple of prototypes of that. But
It's
then
a
the
cool
idea
idea.
that it was really cool. The idea then just evolved into the Kino videos, and that so David Blue's character would be kind of floating the Kinos around filming things, but we really wanted to do that. And I know one of the things on the agenda to talk about today was the SGU virtual season that I wrote.
Yeah.
One of the episodes from the virtual season was the concept episode that I wrote for the second screen experience.
Cool. You got to reuse some of the story idea.
Yeah. I mean, it would never be made into a real episode because I wasn't part of the writer's room or anything, but I put that one together as like, here's the idea of like, if you have an episode with this story, this is what the second screen experience could look like. And, we had worked that through with the folks who, it's very complicated, the relationships between MGM production company, posts, studio, Microsoft, all of this kind of thing. And it just ended up being too complicated to navigate through all of that.
Yeah.
But it was the idea ended up being pretty cool, and then they made the Kinos out of it, which I thought was great.
Yeah, the Kinos again ended up being a really standout. I mean, kind of, I think, conceived as a collection of marketing material. At the end of the day, they were online content to sell the show, but they were also canon short films, so they're also the show.
They just added beautiful texture to the show, though, because there's sometimes you've got 45 minutes of show, and then sometimes it's just character development stuff that you can't squeeze into those 45 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
But if you put that as like the Kino videos or as supplementary material like that, that can, if you're a fan and you try to consume everything, that can really give you all of those get
And
to know
we,
the lesser characters better.
right, as transparent as writers like Joe Malazzi have been online with fans over the years, we've known for many, many years that with Stargate, of course, every show probably, but with Stargate, when you're cutting for time to run on cable,
Yeah,
usually the first things that go are those smaller, intimate character moments that flesh
yeah,
out a character, but maybe aren't vital to the plot. And now with
yeah,
Kino episodes, the show had a vehicle to potentially
yeah,
take that material. I don't know
yeah,
that they did. I
exactly.
don't know that they used cut material for it. I think they were all written and directed as Kino episodes. But
I believe so.
it's kind of amazing, yeah, to have that sort of second screen venue for storytelling.
Yeah.
Okay,
But
so
wouldn't it have
yeah,
been
we
cool
got to
if you
get to all
could watch
this.
the, yeah,
Sorry, say
wouldn't it have been
again.
cool if you'd been able to watch the main episode and then like stuff in parallel to what's going on in the show? That kind of stuff to see what's happening in the lower decks. I really wanted to do that,
Yeah,
but it didn't work out.
the lower deck stuff is fascinating. All those supporting characters, all the scientists and the grunts, getting to see them
Yeah,
their sort of workaday life, and then every once in a while we'd hit one that would tie in with the plot of an episode in some small way.
yeah,
I
yeah.
love it.
Totally.
Okay, SG-1 then. Do you have a favorite character, favorite episode from SG-1?
Oh boy. It's been so long that I can't really pick a favorite episode, but I think, the Jack Sam dynamic has always been my favorite. Jack's just slightly sarcastic edge. I think, I would say, I have to say it would be Jack because of that. Particularly when I rediscovered that when I was doing the Stargate AI stuff, because, I really wanted to dig deep into his character. I built the thing called Jack's Brain, if you remember that visualization. And, there was one episode that we
Yeah,
did.
I've got on one my little preview that I pulled up
You're
here
so
for some
bad.
of the companion stuff. There's this visualization that you guys did for Jack's
Yeah.
brain.
And remember, this was all before ChatGPT or anything else came out that we did this. And this is the same basic underlying technology. I don't know if you want to fast forward that a little bit, and you'll
Yeah.
see the visualizations of his brain, where it's kind of like showing, how these are words that, when dealing with Sam, in particular, how different words would light up when he was talking to Sam or Sam was talking to him, then words would light up with other characters, and beginning to see some of the special relationship between them. Sorry, that video is not really doing it too much justice right now, but I think we can go
Yeah,
back and
I
take
was
a look
watching
and
it this
explain it in
morning.
more detail.
It's
Yeah,
really fascinating. You give
it's
a better explanation here in the companion video.
it's pretty cool, right? But then, we wanted to make one episode that was a comedy. And, one of the episodes where there's a thing attached to the Stargate, and Sam and Daniel are kind of sciencing the heck out of it, trying to speculate what it is. But Jack's going like, it's a bomb, and then, that ends up being the ongoing conversation between them, like, and he's just like, it's a bomb. And Richard, as an actor, was just brilliant when we did the read through that. Every time he said it's a bomb, he did it differently. And at the end of that episode, of course it explodes. And like he was like, I told you it was a bomb. And it was the most Jack thing ever. And I think that's when I fell in love with Jack, was when we did that one. It was very, very cool. And I mean, there's stuff in the videos that people can watch, but I wish we could show everything, all the behind the scenes stuff,
Yeah,
because I never laughed so much in my life as like making that, those episodes with those folks. I almost wet myself a few
I
times.
bet. I bet.
And Richard
Okay, let's
in
come back to
particular
that.
is
Let's
so
come back
funny.
to that
Sure.
for sure. But the SGU, do you have a favorite character and or episode that stands out all these years later?
I think David Blue's character, Eli, for similar reasons to, I seem to like the Science Geeks, right? Similar reasons to that one, to Atlantis. And favorite episode, I think, has to be Water, because I was just behind the scenes while they were filming it. And,
Yeah.
go back and I watched that and we're like, I was there for that, coughing my lungs out. So it was a really, really good show. And I like that it was paced very differently, and it was trying not to do the same thing again, but to use the same people and the same formula in a different environment. And, as a result, it was really good and ended too soon, unfortunately.
Well, where do you want to go first? Do you want to talk about the AI Stargate project, or do you want to talk about some of your other work, like the comics?
Sure. I mean, I can talk about the comics
Which came
briefly.
first?
Uh,
Companion's all pretty
Stargate,
recent,
the
right?
comics came first. The comics came first, and yeah, I unfortunately the comics were a really bad experience.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, I think I blogged about it once, but it's like, it's I give advice to people now trying to do freelance work in the entertainment industry.
Yeah,
That's really along the lines, if you work for free, people will treat you like you're worthless.
like you're worthless.
And that was my experience with the comics, unfortunately.
That's
The
too
you
bad.
know, I signed a contract to write six SGU comics that were going to be the prequels. And, after I'd written three and a half of them, and there was no sign of anything happening. There was no sign of paychecks.
Oh, wow.
And it's not like, I mean, I'm happy to deal. They paid $10 a page to the writers. So in my case, to the writers, so it's, that 20-page comic, they would pay $200. Six of them was $1,200. So it's not
Hmm.
like bank-breaking stuff. And I accepted it because I don't want to write comics, and I
Yeah.
want to write SGU comics. And I really believed in the prequel, that it was supposed to be written from outlines by Robert Cooper, but
So I
I mean the
remember this. This
outlines.
was SGU Icarus. This was solicited. I remember seeing it at least as like an issue 0. I didn't know if it was going to be a series or not, but I
Yeah,
remember it being advertised and then not happening.
it was advertised and it didn't happen, and I just don't know what happened. There seemed to be some weird politics behind the scenes at the publishers, because not only did that not happen, but there was a charity piece. I think there was like an auction where you could have your face in a Stargate comic,
Hmm.
and there was a Stargate Atlantis comic that like various fans had, or maybe it was part of the Kickstarter, that they would be included in a Stargate comic, and it was an Atlantis one.
Hmm.
And I actually wrote that. And we even got as far as like writing it and then getting the outlines and the drawings all done. But then by the time they published it, they used different writing. It was really weird because it was like the panels had all been
Strange.
designed based on my script, but then they did a different script. There was some weird stuff happened behind the
They
scenes. I don't
shoehorned
know
a
what it
different
was.
script into it. Wow.
Yeah, and then for the SGU ones, it was a six-part series, really leading up to the events at the beginning of the pilot episode. So I was pretty excited about it. I wrote three and a half episodes. I think they're available online. I just released them for people to read. But then it got cancelled before any of them had ever been done. And yeah, it was
That's a
pretty
shame.
nasty.
That's a
Yeah,
shame.
but
And it was from Rob Cooper's notes, is that right? Did he sort of work
it,
with you, or did he just have some sort of background material that he had generated while
it,
they were
I
working on the
mean,
pilot?
very loosely background material. It was like, I mean, we're really talking like two or three sentences per episode. It's like this will be an episode about, this character, that kind of thing. This will be an episode about Naquadria, that type of thing. And it was pretty much that. So it was good that
Okay.
I kind of saw where he wanted to go, with two or three sentences, but then I was able to put the flesh on the bones and write my own stories. But yeah, unfortunately, they didn't see light of day, but oh well. But yeah, I think that's always a good advice that, I learned that the hard way, that it's really weird, but if you charge people tons and tons and tons of money to do a thing, they'll treat you with respect. But if you do it out of passion, I found that they just didn't. And so, yeah, I was very upset with the comics, but, c'est la vie. That's the way it goes. You live and learn.
Well, that's too bad. Pardon me, I'm just coughing.
No worries.
I've got a mute button so that it doesn't go out on the live stream, but you'll still hear me cough.
It's the bad story that you have an allergy to. Let's move on to the better stuff.
Yeah, I brought this up with Jenny last week, and I think Jenny was right. I don't think I'm sick. I think it's allergies.
Oh yeah, it's the time of year.
Yeah.
My
So, I
patio
mean,
is covered in pollen.
my experiences with with licensees has been not as bad as that. But somewhat similar. I did some writing for Rittenhouse, which does trading cards many,
Okay.
many years ago. And they paid me in trading cards,
Okay.
which as a, 20 something who was doing this on the side as a lark was fine.
Yeah.
And I've
Yeah.
got a couple of sets of the trading cards now that are worth, with autographs and all the special costume cards and
Very
all the
cool.
all the rare ones in the collections. They're worth some bank if I were to sell them. But
But you never would.
but they didn't pay me in cash. Certainly not.
Okay.
Certainly not in the form of money.
And then the funny part was after they canceled SGU, they were like, do you know the movie Equilibrium? And they asked me to then write a prequel series to Equilibrium. And
Hmm.
the same thing, I pitched a six-part series. Comics, six parts is usually good because then you can assemble it into a trade paperback. So
Right.
you notice like the SGU comics and the Atlantis comics were generally six episodes. So I wrote a six episode pitch for the prequel to Equilibrium that was called Equilibrium Deconstruction. And then
Nice.
I wrote
Christian
one,
Bale.
and that one was Christian Bale, yeah. So there's a comic book with Christian Bale and me on the cover. It's really cool.
And you're on the cover too.
And yeah, I have them around somewhere, but so wrote one of those. One of them was published and then it was canceled. And then I received a check in the mail for $10, for it.
All
And it
right.
was like I got 50 cents a page. I don't know why they changed
Every little
the
bit
contract.
helps.
I never cashed it. I still have it in my drawer. I never cashed the thing. Just it's a good lesson that get a contract, work at the proper rates, that kind of stuff, and get protection. And I'm a member of the writers, the science. It used to be called the Science Fiction Writers of America
Okay.
Association. Now it's called the Science and Fantasy Writers Association. And there was like, you know what? I can get the lawyers of the association to talk to these people, but I was like, nah, it's just not worth it. Let it go. So someday and someday it'll be paid off in karma. And then it was when the companion came calling to do the SGAI stuff. So it's like it's all good.
Yeah. Well, hopefully it's all cumulative, and
Yeah,
even the work that doesn't pan out, that doesn't get published or doesn't pay well, ends up being
yeah.
a a brick in the road that gets you to the next thing.
All in all, it's just another brick in the road, right?
Ocean
And Pink
Stars in the
Floyd.
chat says, Lawrence, what a shame the comic books didn't work out. Would have loved to see them. Yeah, for sure.
Me
Uh,
too. Me too.
and Chop LO7, salute to my Stargate family. I made it a little late, but I'm watching from the beginning, so I'm behind you guys in the chat. Salute the
Salute them all.
mods. Yeah.
Saluting.
Glad you're all here with us to hang out and talk about Stargate today. You mentioned the fan fiction project you did, which is fascinating. I still
Mm.
see references to this today. For folks who are not familiar with it, right? Spend a little time on the Stargate subreddit, and after a few days, somebody will bring up, "Hey, did you know they wrote a third season of SGU and it just didn't get filmed?" Well, no, it's okay. Technically, it's fan fiction. I read episode 1 this morning. It's excellent. It's
Oh, thank you.
extremely well written. The characters sound like themselves. The plot is compelling. So I'm
Mm.
looking forward to seeing the rest of the series. But this has been out for a good number of years now. This is, let me find it here. Episode
Oh
1
my God.
is Stargate Universe Journey's End.
I think
So you wrote,
2011.
how many of these are there? 10 teleplays?
I think there's 7 or 8.
And it's sort of
Um,
a virtual season 3. Uh,
yeah,
and it's written, it's fan fiction that's written in the form of a teleplay. So it
yeah,
looks like what they would have on set to film with. So I could see
exactly.
how fans come across this online, and boy, it sure does look like the season 3 premiere.
Have a read. I think it's really good. It's funny. I had to put that watermark on it because people were selling them at conferences as real
Oh,
scripts.
they were selling them.
Yeah, so
That's
that was like
ballsy.
I didn't want that to happen. So yeah, I'd had some folks kind of reach out and say, "I just bought your screenplays. When is it being made?" And I'm like, "What screenplays are we talking about? Why did you buy them?" And it was like they were kind of upset. So I put those watermarks on it so that nobody would try to sell it at a con. But how did these come about? I
Yeah.
think it's two parts of the story. The first part was what I was talking about earlier with the second screen experience thing. So I think episode 3 of the virtual season is called Racing the Dawn. So that was the idea for an episode that I pitched to MGM, like while I was working on the stuff for season 1. Again, I wasn't part of the writer's room. I
Yeah.
wasn't trying to take jobs from anybody, but I didn't know any of the plots of any of the episodes. So I said, okay, I'm just going to write my own and say, like, here's how the second screen experience would work. And so Racing the Dawn is a really interesting one where the Destiny enters like a star system and a star goes boom,
Hmm.
And after when the star goes boom, the interesting thing that happens when you think about the physics of it is if you hide in the shadow of a planet, you've got thousands of miles of rock between you and all the radiation. So you can be protected from some of the eject from the star while you're hiding there. And then you think about what's happening on the planet itself is that people on the day side have all been frazzled to death, but some people on the night side will have survived. So the idea was then like Destiny is kind of like in orbit above the night side, and they realize, this is a almost like a prime directive thing from Star Trek, where this is a pre-warp style civilization and they're dying. And when dawn comes, they will all die because
Yeah.
the planet will rotate round into the radiation of the sun. So then they have a moral dilemma. What do they do? Right? Do they just let them die? Or do they try to preserve some of their civilization? So that was a story I came up with. It was called Racing the Dawn. And,
It's a good idea.
it was a little naive because I didn't really understand the characters. I hadn't seen an episode of SGU yet when I first came up with the story. When I wrote the virtual seasons, it was after I'd seen two seasons. So you'll see there's a bit of a disjoint there. This feels in many ways more like an episode of Star Trek.
A little
I'm
more
even referring
standalone,
to directive and stuff. Yeah,
episodic. Ship arrives at a planet.
exactly. But then it was like, it showed some of the underlying mystery that was behind the virtual season three. And the whole idea from that one was to show off the lower decks. So then the idea is like if we did the second screen experience, that would come from there. So that when it came time to write the virtual season, why I wrote it is kind of funny was 2010, 2011. I had written a series of sci-fi novels, The Fourth World, The Million Year Journey, The Legend of the Locust, that were really, really, really popular on Kindle.
Hmm.
And there was a woman who was a producer at Disney whose nephew read these books back to back like 1,000 times. And they're full of Stargate Easter eggs. There's even a ship called Destiny in them. And, that she's saying, Auntie, you have to make this into a movie. You're a big shot producer. So she said, I have to reach out to the author. She reached out to me and then she asked me to go down to LA to pitch the idea to Disney.
Oh,
Because
wow.
at the time, Disney were looking for, stuff for boys.
Yeah, the next big
And
YA thing.
exactly. And it was like Disney had lots of princesses, that kind of stuff, but they were really looking for things for the male audience. And it was like this producer's nephew was a young boy and he was geeking out over these books. So it was like before I went down, I had to put together a pitch deck. I had to put together a screenplay of the book, and I'd never written a screenplay before. And the last thing I wanted to do was write a really bad screenplay as like the first draft of the book because I don't want to take my shot, and give them a pile of crap. So I said, oh, SGU has been cancelled. There are a lot of people trying to bring SGU back. I've already written this one story. I had an idea for a story arc that I wanted to tell. So in the space of like 4 or 5 days, I sat in a
Oh.
Tully's Coffee. You remember Tully's Coffee?
Oh,
They used
yeah,
to be big here
Tully's.
in Seattle. I sat in the Tully's Coffee in Issaquah and I knocked out like just practicing 7 or 8
This was
screenplays.
practice. SGU virtual season 3 was practice for you
Was
to figure out how to
Yeah,
do a teleplay for your own IP.
exactly. Exactly. Just so that I could figure out like, pacing,
That's amazing.
action, dialogue, all of those kind of things. And, by the end, when I'd sat down and finished them, and the theme was I love Isaac Asimov, and go and read a short story by Asimov called The Final Question, or maybe it's The Last Question. And it's one of the greatest short stories I think ever written. And you'll see its DNA throughout the virtual third season of SGU. Because when I watched the first two seasons, I was like, they're doing the final question, that kind of stuff. That's the underlying mystery of this
That's
whole
really
thing,
cool.
and so that kind of wanted to put that into story and then turn, once I kind of broken my duck of like writing like that one. That's when I turned The Fourth World into a screenplay, and then I went to Disney and kind of pitched it to them and showed them the pitch, and they liked it, but they didn't buy it.
They didn't buy
And
it.
then not long after that, they bought both Star Wars and Marvel, so they were living up to their word of they wanted to do stuff for boys. But I was like, you should have bought mine instead. It would have been a lot cheaper.
Yeah, you need some indie properties to develop from the grassroots.
Yeah, but yeah, so that's where the virtual third season came about, and
That's
I'm
amazing.
very I'm proud of the writing, but I do have to call out one thing.
Okay.
Is recently if you've read the what's it called, the Three Body Problem series by Qixing Liu, one of my favorite sci-fi series ever. But Qixing Liu recently came out at a sci-fi conference when asked if he was going to write a sequel, and he said he can't anymore because
Mm.
a fanfic that was a sequel, and in a lot of fans' minds, that's the official sequel. And it's hard for him to now swim upstream against a fan to be able to write his own work.
Oh, wow.
And it
Because the
massively,
fanfic was so well received.
exactly.
Wow.
And, and it's like massively damaging for him as an author to be able to do it.
Oh,
And when I was
that
reading that
hurts.
interview, I was like, oh crap, what have I done? So even when I first did the Stargate AI stuff with Brad, and I did a podcast with Robert, off screen before I did them, I'm like, I'm really sorry about the virtual season. I hope I didn't ruin it
Now
for
there
you.
can
But they're
never
like, nah,
be
we
a
didn't read
true
it. We don't
season
read
three
fanfic.
because of you. No.
Yeah, exactly. So Stargate fans, there's no season three, and it's all my fault. No, just kidding.
No, but I brought this up to Jenny when she was on last week, and Jenny wants to know, Jenny Stiven wants to know, did you ever show Brad or Rob? Did you
I
get their
told
feedback
them
on
that it
your SGU
exists.
stories?
I told them that it exists through apologizing, like I just did, because I learned how damaging it can be to them, and there was no intent ever to damage. But they never read it. They don't read fanfic
Yeah,
quite wisely. I don't think
yeah,
pros ever read it because of potential story pollution.
yeah.
So yeah, it's and I think that's exactly the right way. So had I known at the time, I would never have released it publicly. But it's okay. I guess all's well that ends well, and I'm glad people enjoyed it and got some closure from it. But I hope it doesn't
Yeah, that's it
prevent,
exactly. It's
you know,
it's closure. SGU still
yeah,
hurts. What are we at? Almost 15 years. No, this is May. Oh my gosh, it's this week. 15 years ago this week SGU ended.
yeah.
So just yeah, that little bit of closure, even knowing okay, it's fanfic, it's not canon, but it's
My
it's
favorite
salve for the wound.
my favorite song of all time is John and Vangelis's "Somehow I'll Find My Way Home." And I don't know if you know the song. If you don't, go listen to it when we're done here. It's a most beautiful song. And it's like, that became the theme. And particularly, you'll see it in the final episode of the virtual third season that, somehow my way home. And it just seemed perfect for it. Healing.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's see what's going on in the chat. Jeremy Foucher says, "Oh wow, I've been reading this years ago and never realized it was you, Lawrence. We
Oh,
found the
there you
guy
go.
who wrote the thing."
Yeah, guilty as charged. I hope you enjoyed it, Jeremy. And again, I apologize to everybody involved in the production if it ruined things for you. So,
No, no, I think this was all after the fact.
yeah.
Istil Haas says, I want to read this. Even if it's not canon, it's still a continuation of a story I love but have no closure. That's it exactly.
I think that was the idea, that there is closure in this one. It is written to be the end, and not in some ways not just the end of universe, but kind of the end of that chapter of that phase of the Stargate saga,
Mm.
because there are elements of SG-1 and Atlantis end up in it as well. So I haven't read it for a few years. I need to go back and read it myself and
Yeah.
remember. The ending is a little controversial. Some fans didn't
Okay.
like it, but I'll minor spoiler: people die, and I'll just leave it at that. So.
Nicholas M2861, thank you for the gems you brought to Stargate. I love
You're
Stargate
welcome.
Universe. I relate to Eli in many ways.
Me too. And funny
That's true for a
story
lot of
was
us.
there was like I think you were at this party, Darren. There was a launch party at the San Diego Comic Con for Stargate Universe. I think that's when I first met you. So before the first season of Universe,
Might have been
and
David. I wasn't at the SGU
oh, you
launch.
weren't. Oh, sorry. It was some other one
I
then.
think I was
Anyway,
in
but
Scotland by then.
um,
Yeah, I moved to Scotland in the fall of '09. But I
why
was
did
at
you
I was at
come?
the Origins Stargate Origins party at Comic Con.
Oh, okay. Then yeah, there was somebody else. I'm sorry. I was somewhere else we had met. But anyway, at that party, David Blue, who played Eli, was obviously a huge tech fan, a bit of a tech geek. And that we were kind of sitting and chatting, and he was like, "Oh my God, you work for Microsoft. I want to ask this and ask this and ask this and ask this." And we're having a great time chatting. And then he was just like, "I wish I had your job." And I'm like, "I wish I had your job." And he's like, okay, let's swap jobs for 24 hours. And we shook on swapping jobs for 24 hours, but I never got to act. And I guess he never got to work for Microsoft. So,
Too
it
bad.
was, so that's after that, Eli was still my favorite.
Yeah.
If I can go off topic for a moment, a funny
Yeah, please.
story happened at that party because I was leaving it. And then outside, I was waiting for a bus to my hotel was in the outskirts. And standing at the bus stop was Ron Moore
Oh,
of Battlestar Galactica fame. And, at the time, Battlestar Galactica was obviously feverishly popular. And I probably had one too many drinks, and he had had one too many drinks. And I went up to him and I was like, Ron, the Microsoft stock, I think it's all your fault that we're not doing well. And he looked at me and was like, "What? Why?" And he's like, "Well, your show, Battlestars, like shows on Friday nights, right? And it's like my entire division of Microsoft, we don't get a thing done on Friday because we're all speculating on what's going to be on the show on Friday night. And then we don't get a
nice.
thing done on Monday because we're spending the whole time talking about what happened in the show. And that's like 40% of our productivity down the drain because of you. So it's your fault our stock is depressed right now." So he just told me to bleep off and walked away.
Good.
Yeah,
That
so
sounds like it's
that was my
about the right response.
yeah, exactly. I thought I was being funny, but I guess I failed. Oh well. Oh,
Weren't
those
you about to
allergies
host the
there.
show for a minute?
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so shall we move on to what was on? Oh, let's talk about. Should we talk about AI and TV and film production in general?
Yeah, let's start with the
Is
Stargate
it
AI project with the companion that you were involved in, before we
sure?
talk about kind of AI at large. Because
Okay.
this was the genesis of this thing was back in the day when AI, it feels like to me, at least as an outside observer, AI was more a curiosity. It was
Hmm.
interesting. It was producing stuff that was, funny, which is
Yeah.
I think where you guys ended up with the first version one Stargate AI. It was sort of a, if I just hit the suggested word on my phone over and over again, what kind of
Yeah.
sentence is my
Exactly.
phone going to generate for me? That set in the
Yep.
Stargate universe. So let's start with version one of the Stargate AI project with the
Yep.
companion. How you got involved with that, and
Sure.
what the early challenges were.
Yeah. I mean, how I got involved was pretty straightforward. Excuse me, I was browsing Twitter and I love Brad and I've been following him forever. And he posted a video where he was chatting with the other Lawrence. There's a Lawrence in the companion, and they were saying it's like, hey, the 25th anniversary of SG-1 is coming up. Wouldn't it be great if we could like do a table read with the actors? And wouldn't it be even greater if we could get an AI to write it? And it was like, and they were like kind of chatting over and back about that. And I kind of slightly sarcastically replied, like, hey, wouldn't it be great if you've already worked with a guy who knows technology and is now leading like AI at Google? And then Brad answered me right away, and I was like, "Oh, I remember you.
Somebody you
Can
already
you do
know,
this?"
Brad. Tap tap tap.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
This
Wink,
was
wink, nudge, nudge.
because
Say no more.
right, they wanted
Um,
to do a table read, right? And
yeah,
they were looking for material to do a table read with. And Brad, I think at this point was working on a new Stargate script, and obviously didn't want to hand that over to the companion for a public broadcast. So they were like, okay, what can we use that's not, something that MGM doesn't own?
yeah, kind of pretty much that. And so yeah, there was like, they thought like AI had reached the point where it could do that kind of thing, and it wasn't quite there yet. But I teach a lot of AI. I have many courses online where like I've taught millions of people how to build it. And there was a technology at the time. Well, nowadays there's transformers, not the robots in disguise,
Hmm.
but the technology that powers something like ChatGPT. But
Right.
the T in ChatGPT stands for transformers. But prior to that, there was a thing called LSTM, long short-term memory. And in one of my lessons in long short-term memory, I kind of taught people how you can train an AI to do Irish drinking songs, and have an AI generate Irish drinking songs. And LSTM was the best technology for this at the time, like a bit more advanced than autocomplete on your phone, where it could learn from patterns and that kind of thing. And so I was like, we could write an LSTM for the Stargate scripts. At the time, the Transformer was just too hot. It was people were afraid of it.
Mm.
Google had actually invented the Transformer, but it wasn't until OpenAI released ChatGPT that it became a public thing. So I was like, I wanted to do something, but I couldn't use transformers. So I did an LSTM, and that's when trained it on the first script. Or I actually did a whole bunch of LSTMs, and I think it was one thing that we did differently that I don't think anybody has still done yet. Whereas instead of training an AI on all of the scripts, I kind of trained multiple AIs. Like if I use Jack, for example, I trained one on how he should react when Sam talks. I trained one on how he should react when Daniel talks, another one on when Teal'c talks, and then another one on when everybody else talks. Because AI, and particularly in language AI, all it is pattern recognition. If you're happy and you know it,
Mm-hmm.
clap your hands,
Clap your
right?
hands.
That kind of stuff. So it's like, it's that kind of pattern recognition has been trained on. But I wanted to get into a lot more detail for Stargate. So instead of Jack, what he would generally say in response to anything, that the personality would shine based on his response to different characters. Then also how Jack would respond to an action description, right? So if the action description was like, there is a device on the gate with wires hanging out of it,
Mm-hmm.
he would respond, it's a
It's a
bomb.
bomb.
Where Daniel and others might respond, oh, let's investigate this scientifically. So I ended up writing a whole bunch of AIs, like that kind of stuff, and then throw them in a big mixer and just see what happens, how they all talk to each other and how they all react in order to spit out a story. And then that's what we did for the first one. And LSTM is obviously nowhere near as sophisticated as the Transformer. And that's why the first one was a lot of techno babble. And David did a brilliant job with some of the words that we gave him. I still remember one word came out was fakaft,
David Hewlett.
Fakaft. David Hewlett, and like he just read that brilliantly, that kind of stuff. And it's we had so much fun because it was making up words. Because I train it on, I'm going to get highly technical for a moment. You don't train it on words, you train it on subwords in order to be more efficient. So, like, Stargate, it could be trained on star and gate rather than a single word called Stargate, stuff like that. So
Hey,
then when it's trained on
what?
subwords, it'll sometimes put new words together from subwords. And that was like in version one, that's where a lot of them were really struggling, like we were really kind of giving the actors a hard time because we didn't let them read it first. And they just had to go cold and
Mm-hmm.
read with all of this technobabble and all of these made up words.
Mm-hmm.
And David actually had a brilliant idea afterwards that, oh, yeah, here we go. Like, download the exact designificus, that kind of stuff.
Designificant.
You can see design and magnificent or something like that kind of getting blurred together. And actually, one thing that David was sharing with me afterwards was as a sci-fi actor, sometimes it's very difficult where he will be kind of going to do like screen reading for a particular show. But often screen reading it's hard to practice ahead of time, particularly if it's a show that has a lot of technobabble. So like, could I like generate a few scripts and things for him so he could practice?
Mm.
And I think I like ended up generating a few like that with weird technobabble so we could practice on it. I'm like, wow, there's potentially an industry there to be able to generate scripts for actors to practice.
Just for practice.
Exactly, because I mean, most actors can't afford to hire a writer to write scripts for them to practice, right? If you're Tom Cruise or something, that's one thing, but if you're like, a TV actor, it's another. So that was an interesting thing that came out of it. But then with 2.0, that's when we moved to using transformer technology, and that's when I was first allowed to show it publicly. And I think I would argue that this is possibly the first time transformers were ever used in a public project. I can't remember the exact date that this came out, but it's probably a year and a half before ChatGPT made transformers public. You can see my quote there is trying to make the story more coherent instead of going in random directions, and that's where the architecture of Transformers was able to really work, and ended up being pretty cool, and it just got better and better and better. I think by the time we did Stargate AI version 3, now everybody was like, "Holy crap! How much this has improved in the last 3 months!" Now I'm scared instead of laughing.
Yeah. So Rick was in the second one.
Yeah.
How had the second one sort of made that iterative progress?
Yeah, so the second one's when I first was using Transformers, because I wanted to get it right with Rick being there. And, you can see we're all a bit more serious looking at this video. But then Rick kept making us laugh. But it was like, that was when we started getting things that did feel like real episodes and had real stories. And in some ways, because I had an underlying transformer, the difference between this and the previous one is that the underlying transformer already had general understanding of language and story, as opposed to just being trained on here's how Jack responds to Sam. This was a case of it's a model of how Jack responds to Sam, but it's built on a foundation that understands language and story. And that's where it could start branching out in different directions and being more imaginative. And that's also when we started introducing image generation, to be able to do stuff. And Rick's comments on some of the image generation, unfortunately, are like can't be repeated on a podcast, but I will say they're very, very funny.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, it was a really, really interesting project, and I had a whole lot of fun doing it, and made some good friends. And one of the things that I think was the best for me that came out of it was the feedback I got from the companion afterwards was that these were kind of filmed and broadcast during COVID, and a lot of people were in lockdown, and a lot of people were lonely.
Hmm.
And it ended up being that like these were the highlights for some folks where they were bonding with the community again. They were seeing their heroes again. We're all happy and laughing and having a good time, and genuinely so. And it was
Yeah.
trained on the very optimistic stuff I was talking about earlier, being a real highlight for everybody, even to the extent that the companion ended up pivoting to do a lot of mental health oriented stuff. And Amanda and Laurence are actually working on a book around mental health and fandom. And it kind of, the whole Stargate AI launched a lot of that. So it's like, seeing that kind of impact. A lot of people skew very negative around AI, and I can see understandably so. But I think this was one of the things where it was like by putting this together with the right people in the right place at the right time,
Yeah.
we ended up having very positive impact, and I'm really, really proud of that.
Yeah. It built a community that's still doing that.
Yeah, yeah. But how it
That's
pivoted
cool.
towards like understanding mental health and
Hmm.
fandom, I think, and raising that, and I can't wait to see Lawrence and Amanda's book. That it's like yeah, I think it's a lot of stories of fans and how fandom helped them through mental health issues that they've collated and gathered together, and it's things like that have been just really, really powerful.
So then version 3 of the AI project is you said the project got to the point where instead of laughing at how goofy the dialogue was, it it
Yeah.
it it felt like a story, right? It felt there was more cohesion. So how does the development of the AI tools that you were preparing for the project, uh, how had that was it that the tools had advanced or you had figured out how to do it better or combination of
Is
both?
it a combination of both? It was larger and more powerful models, as well as instead of building models entirely from scratch, I was building models on top of existing models. So in version one, the only language that the models knew were Stargate scripts and nothing else. By version three, they were built on top of models that understand like English language, understand story structure, understand, fan feedback around Starbucks, Stargate, understand,
Either way.
the characters and all that kind of thing. And then layered on top of that were all of the scripts and dialogue that I mentioned. So it's like, it was like going from somebody who knows nothing except the scripts to somebody who's an expert in language and story who also understands the scripts.
Hmm.
And that's why they became much more sophisticated. And so, yeah, it was, we had a really good time. I wish we could keep doing it. I just want to keep doing it again and again and again. But, someday we'll do another one.
Yeah, is there any hope of another one?
Right now, no, I don't think so. I think it's served its purpose. I think also at the time that the MGM purchase by Amazon was still kind of in limbo.
Yeah,
We did want to have something out there for the fans during COVID, and but now that the purchase has gone ahead and Stargate is being reignited by Amazon/MGM, that that you would probably be treading on eggshells if you try to do something now. But let's see what happens. When the new show comes out, and maybe there's a chance to do some interesting supplementary material or something along those lines.
that would be fun. Well, this was all at such a fascinating time, right? During COVID and then kind of in the years following COVID. Um, AI was
Yeah,
new. I mean, ChatGPT was a marvel when we were playing with what a couple years
yeah,
ago, 3 years ago what was it, ChatGPT 3 first hit the internet,
Yeah.
and sort of we had public access to go and trying to have a conversation with this thing.
Yeah.
Incredibly useful tool, let me tell you, as a coder.
Mm.
Maybe not so great at writing scripts of TV episodes, but when I'm having problems figuring out my PHP and trying to get a script working for the website that has, we had something on the website that had fallen out of support. It was a very old piece of tech that was no longer working. And my sysop Greg and I were just like plugging stuff into ChatGPT saying, we want this to do this. Can you make it go? And it fixed it.
Right. Yeah.
So
I mean,
incredibly useful tool for that sort of thing. But where we're going in this conversation is, of course, AI these days, especially in entertainment, has a pretty significant PR problem.
yeah, yeah. Definitely it does. And first thing I would argue is like first, it's probably best not to personify AI and describe it as having a PR problem
Yeah.
because there isn't really a personification. But I get what we're saying. I do think though we're in a really weird state in the industry where there is in Babylon 5, if you know that show, one of
Oh
my
yeah, I love
favorites.
B5.
The character Kosh has my favorite saying, where he said, "Understanding is a triple-edged sword," and I think it describes AI perfectly because on the one side you have the people who are overhyping it for profit, right? There are major AI companies out there kind of saying AGI is around the corner, or it's going to take all these jobs, or whatever,
Yeah.
that kind of stuff. Buy our products, and that side is cutting. Then on the other side is like the doomsayers who are like, it's we've watched Terminator and, we've read like sci-fi stories about AI taking over the world and all that kind of stuff. And, that's the other side that cuts, and this triple-edged sword. And, the reality is the truth is somewhere in between, but that truth will also cut. So when Joe Straczynski wrote those words, I don't know if he was thinking of AI 30 years later, but it's very, very accurate. And so where I really would argue people to kind of think about where your opinion should lie is to realize you've got these two extremes, and there are people profiting massively, either financially or through influence, by doubling down
Doubling
on
down.
these two
Yeah. To be
stories.
the front,
That kind of stuff.
at the front of the line to make the money.
Oh, totally. And like, I mean, there are people who kind of engagement farming by being doomsayers or by being over optimistic. And there are people who are literally profiting in money by being doomsayers or being overly optimistic. And the reality is the truth is somewhere in between. And I'm not going to be so much of an idealist to say that the truth is all nice and fluffy, that truth will cut. And there will be impact from that truth cutting, but it's nowhere near as bad as the folks on the doomsayer side. And it's nowhere near as good as the folks on the other side say. And then, so a lot of the education work and the advocacy work that I do is really in that space for people to truly understand what this thing is. Right. And that's why I say, first of all, you don't personify it. When you start personifying it, it's an indication you don't really understand it. It's just a
Yeah.
technology.
Say more about
And then
that,
this,
right? So it's not Skynet. We call it an artificial intelligence, but it's not, what we would in philosophy would call a person. It doesn't have
no, not,
agency in that the sense that we think of
so
you and I as persons or intelligences.
yeah, I mean, the first thing I would say I notice that people tend to over-index on the word intelligence and under-index on the word artificial, right? Because if you
Right?
think about artificial in that sense, like, I have an artificial plant on the floor behind me. It looks like a plant. It decorates my office like a plant. Sorry, you can't see it at this angle. Decorates my office like a plant.
Mm-hmm.
It's nice and green and it's very pretty, but it doesn't photosynthesize. I don't need to feed it, that kind of stuff. There are advantages of it being a plastic plant instead of a real one, but there are disadvantages also. And so when we talk about artificial intelligence, we have to remember that word artificial.
Yeah.
And like, so then what exactly is artificial intelligence? Then you have to say, well, what is intelligence? So to me, and I think the best definition of intelligence that I know and that I could come up with is ultimately intelligence is reacting to data in the way a thinking being would.
Mm.
A dog sees a picture of a cat. A dog is a thinking being. It sees a picture of a cat and it goes woof. right? A computer sees a picture of a cat and it doesn't, right? Because it's not intelligent. It's not a thinking being. And then when a computer sees a picture of a cat, it just sees a bunch of colored pixels. So when you want to make an artificially intelligent computer, you want it to understand that the picture of a cat is a cat and not just a bunch of pixels. So it would react to data the way a thinking being would.
Mhm.
And so when you start building artificial intelligence, what you're actually building is something that recognizes images as what they are, as opposed to just seeing pixels.
Pattern recognition and then
Recognizing
putting that
language.
in context.
Absolutely. And like when it comes to language, it's the same thing, right? Like when earlier I said, if you're happy and you know it, you answer, you clap your hands, right? That kind of stuff. So it's pattern recognition in language. Now it seems intelligent if you type to a computer, if you're happy and you know it, and it types back, clap your hands, you go, oh my gosh, how did it know? There's a thinking being in there responding to it. But it's just simulating a thinking being responding to that data.
Mhm.
So it's like when you begin to understand that that's, really the artificial is the important word here, not intelligence, and
That's
we're
very helpful.
building computers and software and systems to react intelligently by simulating intelligence. That helps you understand it a little bit more, and it also helps you prepare for it a little bit more, because it is disruptive. You just mentioned
Yeah.
talking about code,
Yeah.
right? And then talking about generating code, and it will be disruptive in jobs for people who do code. And my advice to people in this case is, if your only identity is as a coder, you should be worried. But if your identity is as a person who understands how to turn the business requirements into code in order to be able to build a system that's beneficial for you and business and that kind of thing, that's the real skill.
Mm.
Now, often too much we do identity as coders. I mean, I'm a coder. I have like my little angled brackets on my sleeve here, my identity as a coder. But so it's like that's the kind of shift that we have to start thinking of, that like if our identity is only in the thing that's easily replaceable by simulated intelligence, that's when we should be worried.
Yeah.
And the same as a writer, if you're a writer who just writes slop, that kind of stuff without like having your own imagination into it and your own heart and soul into it, GPT can produce slop, and, or Gemini or any of the others. I don't want to just blame GPT. And I think
Yeah, if you're a
that,
bad
that
fanfic writer who's just pinching ideas from Star Trek and everything else you write and regurgitating them,
and
a
turning it
large
into
language
slash
model can
fic
figure out how
or
to do that.
romance fic or any of those things. And that's the middle blade, right? That's the understanding is triple-edged sword, and that's the part that cuts, but that doesn't cut you so badly. That's the kind of cut that you can adjust to.
Yeah. And
And
that's what we're
that's
seeing now,
part
right?
of,
We're seeing all these industries adapt to that reality. Not
I think
not just
so.
sort of widespread catastrophic job loss, but trying to readjust to what are the skills that we need to continue to participate in whatever industry we're in.
And unfortunately, there is widespread catastrophic job loss, but it's very easy to paint a broad brush and say it's because of AI. But when you kind of peel that apart and take a look, that the reality for a lot of these job losses, when you see it, is that, first of all, it was overhiring, particularly post-COVID. And then secondly, it was like it's trying to, and here's where AI can be blamed, if I'm personifying it for a moment, that the potential of this technology is so great and the growth curves of it are so great that to build the data centers that are needed to run it costs a lot of money. And so a lot of the companies who are investing that money in building those data centers for the future profits, including the Stargate data centers, by the way, the Stargate AI data
Yeah,
centers.
no relation.
Fun fact, I've actually worked on both Stargate AIs. I think I'm
Oh
the only
no.
person in the world to have worked on both of them. And anyway, but the whole idea is that the investment that they're putting into that money has to come from somewhere. And unfortunately, the easiest thing for companies to cut in like late stage capitalism that we're in right now is operating expenses. And operating expenses are budget and people. And so, like, that's where those cuts are happening as a result. So, but again, I would argue that thinking of that middle sword, that be willing to take the cut on that one by,
Yeah.
changing your identity from just being able to do a thing to understanding the business concept behind a thing, and then you'll be relatively safe.
It's very helpful and it's very clarifying to me. I'm also aware of the fact that in 2026, a lot of what passes for AI is marketing gibberish, right? So AI has become dollar signs in the eyes of the investor class. And so a lot of stuff that I imagine you probably wouldn't describe as AI is now being called AI. things that you take an input and spit out an output that are referred to as AI, are just computer programs. We've had computer programs for a long time. We've had
Yeah,
chat bots for customer service websites for a long time, and they're not
yeah,
AI. If you
absolutely.
have a computer program that takes an input and generates a particular output, we
Yeah.
we don't have to call everything
So
AI.
the way I explain it in my books and in my talks is, imagine a box, and the box has rules and data going in and answers coming out. That's traditional programming, right? You got data, you as a developer, you as a programmer, you as a human figure out the rules that act on that data to give you the answers,
Yeah.
right? If you're writing a game, it's the motion of the ball or the motion of the laser or those kind of things. All AI does is flip that around a little bit, where you give it the data and you give it the answers and it figures out the rules. So, for example, hey, this picture is a cat, this picture is a dog. Figure out what makes a cat, what makes a dog. And that's where the AI as a technology has become really, really powerful. Because if I were to ask a human coder to write code that says figure out what makes a cat and what makes a dog,
Hmm.
it's almost impossible, right? The amount of code that you'd have to write, millions and millions, millions of lines, very, very expensive, and it's not worth it just to figure out the difference between a cat and a dog. But when you get an AI to do it, or you write like a neural network to do this, then it's a case of this picture is a cat, this picture is a dog. Create a thing called a convolutional neural network that figures out like what's in an image. And like in half an hour, you can build a thing, a model that figures out the difference between a cat and a dog. And now you can say that model is artificially intelligent. And that is what brought about already like revolution in technology. Like I'm wearing an Apple Watch right now. This can figure out when I'm walking or running. This can figure out like, if my heart rate is too high, and stuff like that. And on a tiny little device. But if a human were to write code to figure out my heart rate from this device, it could be millions of lines of code. You wouldn't be able to do it on such a small device. But
Hmm.
with an AI model, training it, shrinking it, sticking it on this, it's made like technology like that possible. And that's really all it is. It's much simpler than we give it credit for. And I think, we've all grown up with the sci-fi movies, the Terminators and the Battlestar Galacticas and all that kind of thing, that, where AI became the animosity and the enemy. And in some ways, like, that's kind of fused itself into our culture. And then some people are also riding that wave where it's like, yes, build my AGI, don't build that guy's AGI because he's evil and I'm good. And we're seeing that kind of playing out in the courts at the moment. And
Yeah.
it's a very interesting time to be alive.
Yeah, Ocean Stars in the chat says the show Humans comes to mind on the subject of AI. Shame it didn't continue. Did you ever see Humans? That
I
was a UK
started watching.
import.
Yeah, I started watching it. It's on my list. I
It's
really
great.
like the actress in it. I can't remember her name.
Yeah,
Oh
Gemma Chan's
gosh,
in it.
Gemma Chan. Yes,
She's
thank you.
fabulous. Love that
Yeah.
show. Hellcat says, what are your thoughts on the morality of AI? Is AI not just, sorry,
Not just built off of stolen work.
not just
It's,
built off stolen work. So we train these models, right? They're scraping the internet. They're scraping the sort of whole of human
yeah.
creative production. Um,
So
what
I
do you
think it's a
think?
great question. And I think when we're thinking about morality, it's not the morality of the artificially intelligent model. It's the morality of the people who built it that we should be thinking about. So, for example, there is an issue at the moment with stolen work, where I'm not going to name anybody, but if you follow the news, you know who it is, where they were given the option when training their model to license books properly in order to train the model.
Hmm.
So authors would be rewarded. And I'm an author. I've written like 35 books, and my books were ripped off by this.
Hmm.
They were given the option to do it properly, but instead of spending the time and effort of negotiating contracts with various publishers to do this, they realized there was this great big pile of pirated books on the internet, and they would just train it with that.
They just took the
So then the
shortcut because
question,
it's available on the internet, and in theory, you could stand in front of a judge and make an argument that it's publicly available.
exactly, but the reality was that it was quicker and cheaper and shorter to do it that way. And if you don't do it that way and you're in a space race with the other folks, and you do it right and they do it wrong, they're going to get there before you. It's a lot like the race to the moon in the 1960s, right? So all of those pressures are out there. But the question of morality then isn't about the model. The question of morality, like I said, is about the people building the
People who are
model.
building it and how it gets used, right? And I recall also when we got the first image generation a couple years
Yeah.
back, at least this when it sort of went big and public and popular, seeing AI generated models with like the Getty image water stamp on it.
Yeah. I mean, I mean, images are a little bit different. So let me first explain how it works a little bit.
Okay. Yeah.
So the idea of how image generation works is very, very cool because the idea is like you actually get an image, like say an image of a cat, and then you denoise that image into a thing called a latent space, which is almost like a very compressed version of that image that to humans just looks like noise. But then you're like saying, okay, this image, this noise is actually an image of a cat. This noise is actually the image of a dog. This noise is an anime image of a cat. This noise is an anime image of a dog. And then the whole idea then is like, okay, now if you can just generate random noise and tell it it's a dog, the computer, from the rules it figured out of denoising the image of a dog into noise, it does backwards. And then it turns that noise into an image of a dog. So, like, if you have 100,000 images of dogs that you say these are dogs, and then those 100,000 patches of noise that it learned how to denoise the dog into, this should be a drinking game where every time I say the word noise, take a drink. Uh,
I
that
know what you mean though,
the,
because it's wizardry to me. Go and open a JPEG in a text editor, and you'll get a
yeah,
sense of
you know,
noise, right? It's
but,
amazing
but
to me how computers do this translation work at all. But
But the
continue.
very cool thing then is anybody can then just generate random noise, right? And you generate random noise and you say, denoise this into a picture of a dog. And what will happen is it will try to follow the rules that it did of noising the dog to go backwards and denoise it. And what you'll end up with is, say you started with a million pictures of dogs, that the features that it figured out from turning a dog into noise, it goes backwards. And then you end up with a new image of a dog that's entirely new. So again, going back to morality, that if people were taking images of dogs that were copyright and had a watermark on it and said that like that belongs to this person, that they ended up polluting the model by adding those to it. When there's plenty of images that you could use,
Hmm.
right, that you had rights to use and open to use and free to use and all that kind of thing. And the process, I mean, is an artificial and a simulated way of how you would teach a human to do it, right? Because a human is going to start from a blank canvas, the way the computer is going to start from noise. And then say you want to teach a human how to paint in the style of Claude Monet, you're going to show them lots of pictures of Monet, and they're going to start scribbling on the blank canvas to try to get the same kind of brush strokes and the same kind of colors and that kind of thing. And it's like, by learning the technique, I don't think anything is being done wrong. But in the process of taking data that you shouldn't have taken for teaching the technique and having the compressed versions of the data that you shouldn't be using be part of the repertoire
Hmm.
that you then uncompress to create new stuff, that's where you kind of cross the line a little bit. So it's like, I think a lot of the rhetoric out there that's anti-AI doesn't really understand that nuance. But it's like, I do believe that artists should be rewarded effectively, and there are ways of doing that. And the folks who created the models should have taken that into consideration at day one, rather than taking shortcuts and then trying to figure it out later.
Yeah.
Like in the case of the books that I mentioned, there's a class action lawsuit about it, and there's a settlement still being negotiated about that, where authors are going to be rewarded based on the books that we used. But I mean, it's very little reward. But class action lawsuits, usually the lawyers are the ones that get the most, and the authors are the ones that get left out. But I think ultimately we're stuck with it as a technology. There is nothing wrong with the technology. We're stuck with what we have at the moment where it has been misused in training. But I do have hopes for a brighter future where more original stuff will be rewarded if it's used in training, or more stuff that's allowed for training will dominate, as opposed to things with like Getty watermarks, like you just
Yeah.
mentioned.
We'll get better quality training with better quality models.
Yeah, yeah,
I
exactly.
I appreciate that distinction. Let's shift then to the entertainment industry, right? Because
Yeah,
whether it's coding is one thing, figuring out how to solve a problem uh, with my website with a piece of PHP code that wasn't working right is one thing, right? That's really straightforward. When you get into the artistic sphere, and you've done a lot of work in this personally, a
Yeah.
lot of which we've talked about, where you're in film and television, and it's creative storytelling, and it's all the folks that we know behind the scenes who come together to produce these works of art. Everybody from the writer and the director to the editor and the performers, obviously, and the person who's writing the score,
Mhm.
the gaffers and the lighters. Uh, how do you foresee AI impacting this industry? Um, and where can it do it well? I think a lot of us are really afraid of AI right now, right? We see something like, Tilly Norwood, the AI quote unquote actor, who seems to me to be a PR stunt.
Yeah,
But there's a lot of hand wringing, there's a lot of anxiety. I think a lot of which has got to be well placed, because again, if we're talking about not the AI technology itself, but the actors, the the
yeah,
the people who are using the tools to chase the dollar signs in many cases. Boy, there's a lot of bad people out there, even if
there is.
the tool itself is not inherently evil. How do you see this playing out in the entertainment space, and how can it be used for good and not for evil?
Yep. Oh, great question. I mean, how much time do we have? We probably would want to do two or three more podcasts on this, but let me start with where it can be used for good. And this is part of where I've actually directly involved, and I've been working with some studios around this.
Yeah.
And it's surprising, and it's not what you would think, but the primary part I think where it can be used for good is in eliminating waste. And there's one specific area, there's many, but I'll talk about one specific area where if you're trying to produce a feature film today, it's a very, very expensive process. And, we've seen budgets explode. It's hard to create a movie for less than $100 million nowadays, maybe even more like $150 million for a movie. And, as a result, unless you are Disney, who self-fund, or who's the other one? I think it's Warner, who self-fund, every other studio needs to borrow money to make that movie. So if you're borrowing hundreds of millions of dollars to make a movie, you're taking a huge risk, and the lender is taking a huge risk. So how the studio system generally works is what they will do is like they have an idea for a movie. Now I've sold a movie into a system, so I've been kind of working through this with my movie. And what they will do is they will hire a director, and they will maybe they'll start with the director, do some concept art, and then create like a sales trailer. And the process of doing this on average is $1 million. And then
Just to have a
the
have
idea,
a pitch
yeah,
deck to take to investors.
on average $1 million. And so what they will do then with that is they will take that overseas and then try to sell the overseas rights to the movie. And if your budget for your movie say is $100 million, that if you can make $50 million in overseas sales of the rights of it, so 50% of your budget, then you can come back home and investors will invest in it. The general is like half the money for the US market, half for the rest of the world. And on average, one in about 20 movies works when done this way.
Hmm.
So if you're a studio, you do this 20 times, that's $20 million already, right? $19 million for movies that aren't working and one for the one that does, but that's 20 million against your budget for actually making this movie. So if they can reduce that waste, like, and do it for like 1 in 10 or 1 in 5, they're now suddenly saving tens of millions of dollars that can reduce the budget of the movie. They can make the movie a bit more cheaply, or they can pay the stars and the gaffers or whatever a little bit more instead of cutting elsewhere.
And
And
potentially you
as a
could give
result,
more people a shot.
and you can give more people a shot. Exactly. You can make twice as many movies,
Hmm.
right? So like that's part of where I've been kind of involved is like, okay, using like a lot of analytics now, it's a case of can we start before we spend the $1 million on trying to pitch a movie in another country? Can we start looking at, well, would this sell in China? Would this sell in Europe? Would this sell in South America? And things like that. And maybe nix it before you even begin, and nix the ones that aren't candidates. And the requirements of these markets are all very different. And to start thinking about, or if we sold it in Europe but not in China, but we got 20 million from Europe, and we're not getting 5 million from China. Let's go to Europe because it's okay. That kind of, and to kind of do all of that type of analysis is really, really important. And that's one of the ways that I think, I've been involved in that a little bit. Is to just start trying to help studios out that way by building models that will look at their story, look at their potential cast, look at the genre, look at the director, look at how it's pitched, maybe change how it's pitched creatively to say, if you pitch it this way, it'll sell in China. If you pitch it that way, it'll sell in Europe without changing the story, and things like that. And I think there are many, many, many areas like that where money can be massively, massively saved in the movie business, and reduce waste and create opportunities. So I think I'm definitely an AI positive when it comes to that regard. Let me list one negative. And like, one negative is generally it's primarily from perception rather than reality. But a couple of years ago, we had a writer's strike. And the reason why there was a writer's strike was because the two sides saw very differently how AI could be used. Right. So the producers, no, let me go to the writers first. So a lot of the fear
Writers
of
was
the
like,
writer,
you're pointing a loaded weapon at me. I need a contract that's going to protect myself.
that was a part of it. But when you look at how contracts actually work, so there's different pay scales for unionized writers, and you get a particular dollar amount if you write the first draft. You get a particular dollar amount if you write second and subsequent drafts, and then you get a particular dollar amount for polish. And I'm deliberately doing it like this,
Yeah.
right? And what writers were afraid of was like, okay, well, the producer of the movie could write a really crappy first draft using ChatGPT and then hire me to write the second draft, right? So they want to write a movie about, I don't know, a spaceship that's lost in a distant galaxy, and they just throw out a screenplay of garbage and they don't care, that kind of stuff. And that's the official first draft.
Yeah.
And now they hire me to write the second draft, where in the past I would have been hired to write the first draft.
They can
And
hire
I'm
you
being paid
at that lower rate and say, we already have a
yeah,
script.
exactly. Or even worse, they just hire me to polish it, and the amount that you get for polishing is much less. So you can see writers were terrified that producers would do that, and as a result, that was one of the things they wanted to make sure that they didn't get caught up in, and like, part of the
Yeah. They could
negotiation.
plan for the
And
worst
then
case scenario use of the
producers were the
technology.
other way around, right? We're paying you as a human to be a writer to write this thing. We don't want you to just throw it into ChatGPT and give us a crappy draft. That kind of stuff. I mean, like, you're going to be paid this for the first draft and it's crap. And then we pay you this for the second draft. And now you get both of these because you use ChatGPT instead of just one. So it ended up being that kind of division between the two. And those divisions are both perception driven by human greed and human behavior, nothing to do with AI. AI just became the catalyst to do it. And it's like, it's that kind of driving of understanding and coming up with new ways of thinking and new ways of doing things, not just in Hollywood and in writing and all that kind of stuff, is necessary for every industry. But Hollywood obviously is a very visible one, and artistry is a very visible one. And that's what kind of makes it as flamed as it is now. And then the interesting part was that they did come to an agreement. I think it was, oh my gosh, it was 3 years ago this month. And I think it was a 3-year agreement. I need to go and read up on it again. But like, that's set to expire. And once that expires, there could be issues again. Because of course the technology has changed so much in those 3 years. But so those are two. I mean, I could talk about this for hours, and I don't want to take up the whole thing with that. But there's so much more to this than actually meets the eye. It's very much an oversimplification to say it's ripping off artists when you can prompt a thing into an existence, or it's ripping off writers when you can prompt a thing into an existence. There is an element of truth to that, of course, but it's so much more nuanced than that.
Yeah.
And that's the triple sword. And, it's really trying to figure out what the real blade is that's in between the other two is part of what I'm spending my career doing.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Istelhaus asks us this question. The popular perception of what AI is, how it works, etc., has changed dramatically since 2020, 2021. How do you think that will impact how sci-fi writes stories involving AI? So what's 5 years from now, a blockbuster feature comes out with AI as a plot point? How's that different than, how we were telling stories about Skynet in the 90s?
I can tell what I hope, and I hope that it's more realistic. I think there was one great movie called Her, Joachim Phoenix is one where he's Scarlett Johansson in his ear.
Mm.
That one is really, that's a really interesting exploration of like closer to what AI actually is. And I hope there'll be more stories like that. Earlier, I mentioned that I sold a movie to Hollywood. It's called Vital Powers. And
Is it an AI
part of
story?
it is. And it's a lot about what I've just been talking about, where it's not the reality of AI, but it's people misusing the specter of AI. And in
Mm.
this case, it's a particular character who misuses the specter of AI to effectively take over the country, to trigger a silent revolution where he takes over the country. And the only person who can take him down is his own daughter. And I'm not going to tell any more of the plot other than that. But yeah, so
No,
it's
I'm
like
already
I,
fascinated.
I would hope that there are more stories like that where it's a case of that would be part one, where instead of AI being this thing that's put on a negative pedestal or a positive pedestal that's more normalized, and it's the stories of the people rather than the technology, right? Like I just mentioned in all the anecdotes that I just gave. But then the second one, where AI will really only succeed in society when it fades into the background. We like to
Mm.
talk about AI
Okay,
being the new
interesting.
electricity, right? Like we don't make stories about electricity anymore. Like
Yeah.
back in the days of Faraday and Tesla, they probably made sci-fi stories about electricity. But
Yeah, there was
nowadays,
a,
for
a
us,
popular sort of terror about this, right? We're going to put these wires over
yeah,
your head or running into your
e-
house that if you touch it, can
exactly.
kill you.
Yeah, but for us now, it has faded into the background and it's just part of our everyday lives. And I think when AI becomes successful as a technology, is when it's mundane. It has faded into the background, it's become a part of our everyday lives. And then the stories that grow up out of that, to me, are more interesting. How are we different when this is part of our everyday life? Right? Electricity is part of our everyday life now, so we can tell stories that happen at night that we don't need to be at candlelight. So what will those stories look like? And that's what I'm interested and excited to see, because that will be kind of more accurate around what the future looks like. Um, if I liken it to human history, it's not that long ago we made movies about cowboys and Indians, where Indians were the bad guys, right? It was like this other. And like we're talking 50, 60 years ago, that's like not that long ago. Nowadays, we don't make those movies anymore because it seems naive and silly and offensive. And I think, it's a similar thing with the Skynets and all that kind of thing of the world, that when artificial intelligence becomes this more background thing that's just part of our everyday lives, making movies about Skynet and that kind of thing, maybe not offensive, but they'll seem silly and naive.
That's why Hal was so terrifying as an antagonist in 2001, right? Because in 2001, Hal is benign. It's not a super AI that's at the center of the story. It's
Yeah,
like suddenly your coffee maker decided
yeah,
to, prioritize
yeah.
something other than your existence.
I'm sorry, Darren, I can't answer that. Not kidding. You know where the name HAL came from, right? It's IBM. It's the letters after IBM in the alphabet, or before in
Before
the alphabet.
IBM, I did not know that.
Yeah, HAL. So,
That's fantastic. Patrick
any other?
Manley in the chat says, "Great show and topic. AI is like the cat that got out of the bag. In this case, it is a mountain lion and will be very hard to put back in. So we need to learn how to integrate it responsibly."
Yeah, I'm the optimist in me is saying that the AI models that are currently out there, particularly the ones that have been perhaps irresponsibly built, compared to the models of tomorrow, they're toys. So there's always an opportunity for us to responsibly build the models of tomorrow. And I think the level of awareness that's out there, and particularly things like the court case that I mentioned earlier on driving, that kind of awareness, we realize that we've built these great big powerful things today. They look amazing and they're scary and they're terrifying. But 18 months from now, they're going to be toys. 36 months from now, they're going to be, less than toys.
Toys in the
So
sense that
those
we have
future
something
ones.
else that's more seriously powerful.
Well, I mean, there will be, because I think, first of all, there's two elements of it, right? Number one is more intelligently designing the algorithms for the model itself. We're constantly learning how to build better models. The transformer was a massive inflection point that brought about things like the chatbots that we have today. But, even the original transformer is a toy compared to what we have today. And like there's a hockey stick curve of innovation going on there. I have to say hockey stick because I have a hockey stick behind me. And, but the realization of the need to do it properly is far greater today than it was 12 months ago or 24 months ago. So part of me thinking, like Patrick, I know you're talking about the cat and the mountain lion, but I honestly feel that while that might be a wild mountain lion today, the mountain lion of, 2, 3 years from now, there's a much better chance that that's being responsibly built and is well trained. So that again, that's the optimist in me is seeing that, and hopefully the optimist is right.
I can't remember what it was, but just yesterday I was watching some historical news coverage of from like the late 80s or the early 90s, and it was some technological innovation and how it was changing things and how it was gonna revolutionize everything, and in sort of a with a negative tone overtone to it, right? This was sort of a
Yep.
danger to our next generation, etc. And here I am sitting in 2026 looking at this, just laughing and saying, boy, you guys had no idea. They haven't even monetized this yet. They haven't even uh, you know, put ads in it yet, or figured out how to target people's hatred yet. It just seems so quaint and naive from that historical perspective, and it sounds like you're describing something that's kind of similar, but maybe just 2 or 3 years down the road, we're going to be looking at today's big players and thinking, oh, that was kind of cute what we were worried about back
Halfway.
then.
Yeah. I mean, there's a brilliant video on YouTube, that Leonard Nimoy, Spock, they got him to make this video in 1999 about the dangers of Y2K. And you go and you look at it now, and it's Spock telling you that the world is going to end because computers are networked with each other, that kind of stuff. And I mean, the Y2K was a real problem and there were real issues, but, it obviously the doomsayers, it didn't come true. And I do feel, and I mean, I don't want to make light of COVID. We did have an epidemic, and a lot of people suffered and a lot of people died as a result of it. But when we look at epidemics in fiction, right? All of the epidemics in fiction usually ended up with a zombie apocalypse, right? And we didn't have anything close to that. And in some ways, I would argue, like, the fears that we have around artificial intelligence and around technology built on artificial intelligence are similar. There will be bad stuff. But there is always bad stuff when humans are involved, unfortunately. And the bad stuff is probably stuff that we can't quite predict right now, but nothing like what the doomsayers are saying. It's the equivalent of we didn't get a zombie apocalypse after COVID, thank God. But I don't want to make light of it because there will be disruptions, but it's a case of if we're constantly living in fear of a zombie apocalypse, we're not going to see the forest for the trees. And it's exactly the same thing with AI. Don't live in constant fear of Skynet or whatever, because it's the same stories. Like whoever wrote stories needed some kind of a bad guy in the stories, and it's very easy to write a bad guy of something that nobody understands. And like the same, like in the past, they wrote bad guys, cowboys, and Indians, or they wrote bad guys being, other races and stuff like that. And we've moved on and evolved, hopefully, from writing stories like that. And I think just the same thing's going to happen with AI. And then 30 years from now, the people who are watching stories where AI isn't the bad guy will be, the ones building the world of that time. So I'm kind of again, I'm an optimist about it, but I'm not a pure, purely naive optimist.
A couple folks in the chat a while ago brought up the environmental impact of these huge data centers.
Yeah,
So talk about
great
that.
question.
Talk about the sort of moral implications of the environmental impact of use of energy, water, etc.
Yeah,
Impacts on local communities, but then also in like I see this every day in the tech space when we have like we're in the middle of a RAM apocalypse. There's a shortage of RAM and other silicon. So the price of everything is going up, not just because of tariffs and every other environmental factor, shipping and all that, but they're going up
yeah,
because the data centers are buying up all the silicon, and
yeah,
manufacturers like I bought a ton of Crucial in my time, right? Crucial RAM, and Crucial's not making consumer RAM anymore because these big
wow,
data centers go to the manufacturer and say, we will give you this giant dump truck full of money if you will make
yeah.
all of your RAM for us, because there's such a need. And suddenly it's just not available to the consumers anymore.
I mean, yeah, I mean, addressing the RAM one first, I mean, yeah, it's always supply and demand, right? And the people who have the big pockets and have the demands, unfortunately, constrain the supply. I mean, if I put a positive spin on that for a moment, not just because I work in the industry, but just for my own personal usage, that my personal need for RAM has gone greatly down
Hmm.
because of the ability of data centers that I can use cheaply, having chips that are far more powerful than I would have on my desk, giving me access to them. I pretty much do all of my coding in Google Colab at the moment, so I have access to big, expensive NVIDIA GPUs that
Just
I'm not going
shifting
to pay
that
attention
work to a
to.
cloud.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like even though the availability of RAM to consumers has definitely gone down, the necessity of RAM to consumers, thankfully, has also gone down. Now, that's great for RAM. It's not great for bread and water and milk and energy and all of those kind of things. So using RAM as an example, I think it's okay. The building of data centers and energy usage is obviously a huge concern for me. And one of the things that I've been learning, although I'm very much a novice at this, so don't quote me on it, but like particularly in the U.S. political system, that a lot of the building of new data centers comes with a caveat that they are self-contained when it comes to energy, that they do not draw from the public energy grid and therefore drive up the price of energy for the consumer. And that's a huge pressure at the moment on building the data centers because they got to be able to build the energy to go with it first. And that's fraught with difficulties, right? In Germany, they're doing it with nuclear. It's hard for us to do it with nuclear here. So there's a lot of open questions there. But I think at least the political will is there to understand that people matter just as much as data centers, or probably more than data, hopefully more than data centers. But again, I'm not an expert on that, and this is all very nascent at the moment. And
Yeah.
that's why people like Elon Musk and Sundar Pichai are now talking about orbital data centers. So like these are centers that are in low orbit and are solar powered again because they're completely independently powered and off the grid. And that's a nice segue to go all the way back to earlier. I was talking about the Isaac Asimov story, the final question. That's how it begins. This is why Asimov was a genius. The actual story begins with a computer being powered by solar in orbit and a person saying, "Oh, we'll never need energy again. This computer's going to last forever." And then the counterpoint is, "No, it isn't. You're not thinking." And I'm not going to tell the rest of the story. You have to read
Yeah,
it.
I got to go read it now.
It's brilliant, read it and then watch SGU again. And I think SGU was heading in the direction that Asimov was thinking of there. Anyway, sorry. But so I think with any technological advance, there's always going to be issues. There's always going to be changes, will be breaking changes. And, the bigger thing is instead of resisting the change, is to try and figure out how to mitigate the breaking changes and how to focus on what's important. And I would encourage the leaders of our political parties, and I would encourage the leaders of our businesses to kind of, to continue thinking in those steps that, and I'm going to quote Babylon 5 again, is you should never sacrifice the future to save the present. And, unfortunately, we often take shortcuts as a society, in particular a capitalist society, to sacrifice the future to save the present. But I think, with a firm hand on the wheel and understanding of the long-term implications of things, that I am an optimist. I think it will be okay in the end, but I do believe there will be speed bumps along the way.
So is that firm hand on the wheel? Does at least part of it take the form of governmental regulation?
It can, as long as that government regulation is expert informed and not politically motivated.
Informed, yeah. Because we're in this capitalist
Um,
space race, right? We're this is
yeah,
what social media
yeah,
has been doing for the last 20 years. Now
uh,
it's a different iteration of a capitalist space race. And there's
yeah.
a
I mean,
it seems to me a pretty good argument to be made for looking back at social media over the last 20 years and saying, uh, being absolutely hands off, absolutely laissez-faire has
yeah.
has brought us to some pretty dark places.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think, there's it's almost like that was training wheels for society, right? We started riding the bicycle without the training wheels and we're falling and getting hurt a lot. And, like some kind of regulation is training wheels, but how do we build a society on training wheels that understands how to use this technology so that someday we grow up and we don't need the training wheels anymore? But I used an image once. The word they used was a conclave, which sounds all dark and ominous, but a conclave of AI experts gathered in Saudi Arabia a couple of years ago, and they invited me to be a part of it. And the image that I used with them was like, right now AI is like giving the keys to a sports car to your teenage son. That kind of thing. It's very powerful. It's really, really cool. But do you give the keys to your teenage son? That kind of, and it's
Do
like,
you want to still have
and
the sports car in a week?
yeah, Yeah, exactly. And to prevent the kid getting wrecked in an accident, do away with the concept of a sports car? Of course you don't. But you got to have those training wheels and you got to have those guardrails. But if you were teaching somebody how to drive a sports car effectively, that's not a political thing. That's a technical thing. And it's that kind of technical advice and that kind of technical guidance. It was a lot of what I was doing at Google before I left, giving advice to various governments around the world around like what they should be thinking about and what they should be looking at, and how they should be working with this stuff. And unfortunately, politicians, it's the nature of the game that you're not going to have power unless you win an election. And to win an election, you have to tell people what they want to hear. And what they want to hear isn't necessarily what they need to hear. And it ends up being a very difficult balancing game for them. So it's really that the real work gets done by the cross-party committees that aren't necessarily elected, but they're hired by the people who are elected. And then if you can work with them and influence them, that's when you can start making like real changes.
Let's look at the chat again. Reese Evans says, I happen to be an IP lawyer in the United Kingdom, and some of the issues you've mentioned from US copyright don't apply here. And many places don't respect IP law at all. So how do we work together? That's another one of the giant challenges for the, right, I imagine, particularly for training models and using
Yeah.
copyrighted material.
So that again, I mean, going back to the word that was used earlier, is morality, right? If you're kind of saying, "Oh, if I go to this country, I can do a thing, and I'm not breaking the law," that's legality. But ultimately, if we as humans are not going to be moral in training them, then they're not going to be moral in their usage. So it ultimately goes back to morality.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. Daniel Kolsar. I was thinking about this we were talking about RAM a minute ago. The new way to reduce RAM usage of AI models made the RAM prices drop slightly recently. Yet I'm still happy to upgrade my workstation from DDR4 to DDR5 last summer before the whole thing happened. Yeah, I feel you. It's so strange to me that a lot of our cutting edge 2026, 2027 models of gaming devices and computing devices are suddenly back to DDR4, or last generation RAM, because that's what's currently available. But yeah, this is what I've heard about AI data centers. Maybe you can shed some light on this. Is that they're getting more efficient in how they're using the hardware. So as they grow, right, there's expanding processing need, but also the algorithms are getting more efficient in how they're using the compute power.
Yeah.
Is that accurate?
So, and how they're using the compute power, yes, and also in how they're using memory. I think the biggest bottleneck in training AI is actually memory, as opposed to compute power. And I think, and that's why we're seeing the symptoms that we're seeing. And by the way, Daniel, with that foresight that you had, could you tell me the lottery numbers for next week? No, just kidding. But if you think about like a memory, like a model, like a 1 trillion parameter model, that's 4 trillion bytes that it will generally need to be able to hold all of its weights in memory. And 4 trillion bytes is a lot of memory. It's more than will fit on any one GPU. So it has to be sharded in memory across like many, many thousands of them. And then when you are doing a training, you are kind of every iteration of training, you're rewriting all of those bytes. But there's a thing called an optimizer that you use to be able to do that. And the optimizer needs a copy of those bytes before it can work on them. So now you're up to 8 trillion instead of 4 trillion. Mm-hmm. And then the process itself is done on the GPU on data that lives in memory. So the idea to be able to transfer that data from memory into the GPUs to get the GPUs to do the work and then write it back to memory, there's all of that transfer that goes over and back is like where a lot of the power is effectively being done. And those GPUs, of course, run hot. So a lot of the innovation that's happening is actually, well, how do you manage all of that zigzagging over and back between memory and GPU for it to do what it needs to do? If you've heard of a model called DeepSeek out of China, one of the innovations that they did that was very interesting was export restrictions disallowed a specific technology that was used for very fast transfer between memory and GPU to be exported from the US to China. So what the folks in DeepSeek did was they came up with a compression algorithm that they could compress the memory so they're moving less and effectively move the same faster. And so all of that kind of innovation is going on in the space at the moment, not to mention just the architecture of the models. So I think the models are growing exponentially, but the ability for them to work on hardware is kind of dropping exponentially. So hopefully we end up like at a sweet spot where we'll eventually be shrinking the amount that we need for training. But the difference then becomes as more and more people are using the thing,
Yeah.
that earlier I was saying fade into the background like electricity. Think about all of the infrastructure that's required to run electricity in your home and keep it running. That's the level of scale that we're talking about, but
Yeah.
maybe
And
even
the demand to
higher.
generate it.
And we're only at the dawn of that right now. And I think that's where it gets really interesting.
This has been fascinating. We're at 2 hours now, so I want to let you go, but let's end with this. Ocean Stars is going to bring us back around to Stargate. How
Yeah.
close are we to using AI? Ocean Stars says writing SG scripts, special effects, but let's expand this beyond just writing scripts. How, you've got Martin Garrow's making a new show for Prime Video right now. They're in the process of writing and early pre-production, casting this summer, shooting in the fall. So we've got new Stargate coming. How do you foresee a current production using AI tools, using it in hopefully wise ways,
Yeah.
hopefully ways that are not destructive to people's jobs, uh, using it in ways that are, how do I say this? Uh, Often invisible to us, I think, by the time we see the end product, right? With a credit screen full of hundreds of people who contributed to this, written by a human being, with visual effects that were designed by a human being, production designed by a human being, acted by human beings, scored by a human being. Where are potentially the AI tools available to be used right now that might be integrated into a new Stargate show in ways that we might never see?
Well, if Martin, if you're watching, please hire me and I'll help. No, just kidding.
He's
But
available.
I think there's so many ways that it could be done. But the first ways that I would think about doing it are primarily off screen, and it's really more logistics and production logistics.
Hmm.
Because if you think about it, like, and particularly nowadays, episodes of TV shows are practically short movies. They're not, an episode of a Stargate that was written 15 years ago or whatever, you could go from nothing to having the entire episode in the can in a week or two, and then post-production would happen. And that's how they could produce 20 episodes a year or 26 episodes a year. But nowadays, the streaming shows are 6 or 8 episodes, and they're all massive productions in their own right.
Yeah.
Multiple locations, extra special effects, and so the logistics behind trying to do that and plan that is very, very, very difficult. And I think that's one of the areas where building, or the artificially intelligent systems can actually be done to really help with that, to help with the planning of that, and to help with the sourcing of the materials that you would use for that. And so there's so much that can be done there. I think. Secondly, would be and maybe this one's a little controversial, but to be able to test the efficacy of a script for a show before you ever spend money in filming, post-production, distribution, and marketing of it. A little bit like what I was talking about earlier on with the idea of creating these little trailers for selling stuff overseas. That, like, to take a look at, I mean, there have been two massive flops in the science fiction universe between Stargate, sorry, not Stargate, Star Trek, Starfleet Academy, and Star Wars The Acolyte. And to be able to, you could actually have tested out the story, the messaging, the marketing, the characters, the designs, the tone, the language, the scripts, and all of these kind of things using virtual audiences and artificial intelligence before you actually ever film anything, and maybe able to kind of test it. Well, like, how is this going to work with these different groups? The Acolyte apparently cost like $500 million, and nobody watched it over the May the 4th weekend. That it was a massive flop because there was a perception that the audience would love it, and maybe a much narrower audience loved it than they expected. And, I would hope that, Martin and Amazon and MGM are thinking in those terms that it's like, yes, you got to make it for a new audience. Yes, you've got to be able to make it for a broader audience than traditional cable TV shows. Let me talk about that for a second. And that's a big difference that we have today that I think a lot of people don't understand. But
Mm.
back when you were making Atlantis or SGU, it was being broadcast on a cable network. In this case, it was Sci-Fi that was owned by NBC Universal. But the Sci-Fi channel from NBC Universal was aimed at a particular market, which usually males like 18 to 30. And the revenue that they made was from advertisement, right? So they would broadcast the show that have 4 or 5 ad breaks during the show, and then they knew who who their audience were, and they were okay with the content of the show being geared towards that particular audience because the advertisers would be selling, Star
Yeah.
Wars lightsabers or beer or trucks or
This is
whatever
this is
that
why we had the
geared to that audience.
proliferation of basic cable channels. This is why we have a sci-fi channel is because everybody
Exactly.
was niching down at the time.
Yeah. But the difference now with like Disney Plus with the Acolyte and Paramount Plus with the Starfleet Academy was they're not narrow niche channels. And they're all about driving subscribers. And to drive subscribers, you have to be able to make it broad for everybody. And I think they ran into the buzzsaw of trying to maintain their existing audience group while extending to an existence audience group while alienating their existing, sorry, extending to a new one while potentially alienating the existing one. And a lot of the negative feedback around Acolyte and Starfleet Academy was because of that. But the business is so very different because neither of those can afford to build for the male 18 to 30 audience anymore because they need to drive subscribers. And the expectation is you've got these big, expensive productions. An episode of Stargate was in the single digit millions. An episode of Acolyte was in the hundreds of millions or close to hundreds of millions. And it's like, that's the binds that like new TV shows are actually in. And that's one thing I'm a little worried about with the new Stargate show.
Hmm.
And it's like, I thank God they didn't make it 5 years ago because hopefully, have learned from the mistakes that were made in the last 5 years. And then hopefully they can succeed where those others failed. But that's a headwind that like modern genre TV shows, particularly built on nostalgia, going back to old shows like a Stargate rather than a brand new thing like, like Apple did with Foundation or stuff like, or For All Mankind, that's headwinds that they're actually going to face. So being able to use AI to avoid expensive mistakes, I think would be one of the things that I would encourage them to start looking at, and that would be infinitely more valuable than saving
Yeah.
$500 by using an AI generated texture instead of a human generated texture.
Yeah. And
That
again,
let's worry
invisible to
about
us.
yeah, let's worry about the pounds instead of the pennies. But when we start, most of the time when we're thinking about AI, we're thinking about the pennies. Oh, like save a little bit. The example I used about writing earlier on, like save $75,000 on a first draft by getting AI to generate one. That's pennies. That avoiding those big expensive mistakes by being able to use technology to do research into how this thing could be accepted, and there's so many opportunities there to make it better. So Martin, if you're watching, give me a call.
Great. This has been a fascinating conversation. I appreciate it so much. Thank you for being here. I'm going to try and get through
I,
this without coughing. Why don't you say goodbye to the people while I take a drink?
I have some coffee for you. Here you go. Yeah, well, first of all, everybody, thank you so much for watching this far. Hopefully it wasn't boring for you when we started getting really technical. Any questions? I'm on Gate World. I should sign in more often to the forum. I used to post there a lot. Otherwise, I'm just lmoroney@gmail.com. Please feel to drop me a line, and feel free to ask me anything. I will try to answer all the polite ones. I'll even try to answer some of the rude ones. And if you do enjoy this, please support Darren and the work that he's doing. And please support all the folks in the fan community because a lot of this work is kind of done, just out of the sheer love of what they have for the community and for the show. And it's not heavily rewarded. I know some of the others are now going on to Patreon and stuff like that because it's very difficult and expensive to be in. So please, just support them, support the fandom as much as you can. And thank you, Darren, for all that you do.
I appreciate it. I appreciate it so much. I appreciate you co-hosting the show for a moment. Um, you did great. Yeah, we're gonna have to have you back on. We'll give you your own show.
There you go.
Stargate AI. Yeah. I appreciate the conversation so much, and it's we as Stargate fans are so lucky to have an expert who is one of us, who is a Stargate fan who's
Thank
been
you.
around for decades in our
Thank you.
fandom, who is currently working on and having these conversations and figuring out, the wise ways to move forward with this technology or technologies.
Yep.
So I
Thank
learned a
you.
lot today. I hope you guys did too. Thanks for being here and hanging out with us. We have some more live streams coming up. Here's what the rest of May looks like. Next week, we're going to welcome Ed Gross, who is a sci-fi author who has done lots of behind-the-scenes making of oral history projects for Star Trek, for Superman, Battlestar Galactica, and of course Stargate. He's the author of oh, I have one right here. Ooh. Ed is the author of Chevron's Locked, the unofficial, unauthorized oral history of Stargate SG-1 first 25 years. This book came out a couple years ago. We're going to have Ed on next week to talk about this project, coming into the Stargate world, learning the show, talking to a lot of the cast and crew. And then on May 22nd, we'll talk with Bryce Orrs, who you know from a lot of the fantastic work he's done recently from Stargate Network and more recently the Pegasus Project. If you saw that fly-through, virtual fly-through of the city of Atlantis, that's Bryce's project. He's also working on a documentary on the Stargate feature film. We'll talk about all those things. We'll talk about French fandom with Bryce in a couple of weeks' time. And then our good buddy Jeff from Suns and Shadows will be back to wrap up the month. So lots of fun, lots of live streams coming up. And I'm glad to have all of you here. Thank you to the mods. Thanks to Hellcats for being here. Red Zeon's here. Anthony Rawling was here earlier helping us with the mod situation today. Appreciate you guys so much, and I appreciate channel members. You guys are amazing. Channel members, as Laurence was saying, projects like this are done by fans, they're done for fans, and you guys helped keep the lights on. So thank you to all of our channel members, those of you who are here right now, those of you who might be watching after the fact. If you're interested in Gateworld channel membership, just look for the join button on a desktop browser below any of our videos. Or over on the front page of the Gateworld YouTube channel. Check us out there. I think that's all I've got. Laurence, anything else from you?
Oh, I've got so much more I'd love to talk about, but
You've
I'll
got 2
bore you
more
all to death.
shows worth of things to say. Okay, we'll have to have you
Yeah,
back then.
done. Yeah, sounds great. Thank you so much. This has been a wonderful way to spend a Friday afternoon.
Excellent. I appreciate you so much. All right, guys, we'll see you
All
next
right.
week.